Yes, awesome. Okay, welcome to the next session of Hot Pets, where we've got two interesting discussions, and I think we've mostly finished filling in, so I'm going to let Sandra take it from here and take it away.
Thanks for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, all good. Okay, cool. Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about traffic analysis of encrypted DNS traffic. And this is a work in progress that I'm currently doing with Mark, Narceo, and Carmela. So as we all know, almost every connection on the internet is preceded by a DNS lookup. So let's say we have a client, and the client wants to find out what the IP address is for a particular domain name. The client sends this domain name as a DNS query to a recursive resolver. The recursive resolver contacts a number of authoritative name servers which hold databases of DNS domain names to IP address mappings till it receives the correct answer for the client's query, and it sends this back as a response to the client. Once the client receives the IP address, it establishes a connection with the destination host, and it can exchange data such as HTTP requests and responses. So in this work, we are going to focus on the link between the client and the recursive resolver. So the main issue with DNS is that the DNS queries and responses are unencrypted, which means that they're vulnerable to eavesdropping and tampering. So this gives eavesdroppers an extra channel in addition to the link between the clients and the destination host, on which they can learn more about the activities performed by a client or an end user, such as the browsing history. Another thing is that DNS is used to implement censorship. So parties such as ISPs can look at DNS queries that are performed by clients and can censor based on the queries as well. So if we look at the big picture right now, the idea is to encrypt the connection between the clients and the destination hosts using protocols such as TLS. So the next step would be to encrypt the connection between the client and the recursive resolver. And we already have certain big players such as Google and Cloudflare that have released solutions using DNS over HTTPS to encrypt the DNS traffic between the client and the recursive resolver. So DNS over HTTPS is a relatively new protocol where the idea is to establish an HTTPS connection between the client and the recursive resolver and use that to exchange queries and responses. So what we were interested in studying, and we found out that so far it's not been done, is if the DNS traffic is encrypted, can we still do traffic analysis on the encrypted DNS traffic to find out which domain name is being queried by a particular client? So the question may arise as to why we should even do traffic analysis of DNS traffic in the first place. So let's say that the DNS traffic is encrypted, and then the subsequent connection between the client and the destination host is also encrypted using protocols such as TLS. You still have the IP address of the destination from which you could potentially learn the domain name that the client is interested in visiting. While this may have been true before, now you have the virtual hosts where multiple domain names could reside on the same IP address. So it becomes harder for an eavesdropper to figure out which domain name a client is interested in visiting. Another thing is that you have content delivery networks, or CDNs, which host resources, and often you might end up getting the domain name of the CDN, which is not very interesting from an eavesdropper's point of view. So in order to do our analysis, what we did is we took a bunch of Raspberry Pis and we set them up as clients that can contact resolvers which implement DNS over HTTPS, and these are Google and Cloudflare's resolvers. We considered a relatively simple scenario where there is no client-side caching of DNS responses as a starting experiment. And we ran TCP dump on the clients at the moment to collect traces. Note that even though we are running TCP dump on the client, this kind of analysis can be done on any eavesdropper that is on the link between the client and the recursive resolver. And at the moment, we are looking at the packet sizes, the timing, and the ordering, which indicates the directionality of the packets as features. We also looked at the header information in the TLS headers, but we didn't find anything interesting in our, so we're not going to include TLS header information in our analysis. So when a client contacts hostname, so let's say that you have a browsing session and you want to visit reddit.com, so you sent an HTTPS request to Reddit servers, and then you get a response. But the thing is that the Reddit's web page might include a lot of other resources as well, such as image files, ads, and static files, and these could be residing on other domain names. So there could be DNS queries that are associated with these domain names as well. And we are interested in capturing all the DNS data that is associated with a particular browsing session for a web page. However, in our first set of experiments, which we call as single query experiments, we are interested only in looking at the DNS query and response pair for a particular domain name. And the reason that we conduct these single query experiments is that we want to see if there's a quick way of identifying domain names based on just the first query and response pair. This could have an impact on censorship, where the censoring party might want to quickly determine whether a website has to be censored or not. And also it gives an upper bound on the privacy that can be obtained from DNS over HTTPS solutions. So in order to do the single query experiments, we use Google's and Cloudflare's DNS over HTTPS API. So they have an API where you can send the query and then you get back the response. So we collect the network traces associated with performing this particular API call. So for our first set of experiments, we wanted to gather traces associated with querying a large set of web pages. So we looked at Alexa's top million web page list. So since these experiments are still running, here I'm going to show the results for about 450,000 pages that we have at the moment. And we are considering the packet size information for our analysis. And we look at the anonymity set size, and here I define anonymity set size as the number of web pages with the same query and response size tuples. So we look at the count for each anonymity set size values, and the plot here shows the cumulative distribution of these counts. And the main point that we want to highlight from this plot is that the smaller anonymity set sizes actually dominate our results. And even when you increase the number of web pages that you have, you still see that rather than having larger anonymity set sizes, you have an increase in the number of small anonymity sets. And here's a view for the smaller anonymity set sizes. So what we see is that 1.7% of the web pages that we analyzed have an anonymity set size equal to 1, which means that they have unique query and response size tuples. So you can actually uniquely identify these web pages just based on the packet sizes. And if you look at the list of the web pages that we got, these include pages related to healthcare data. For example, there was a page where, which was for cancer screening. We had financial web pages. There was a page where the idea was to calculate your credit score. And then there are a lot of pornographic web pages as well, which could possibly come under censorship as well. After this, what we were interested in analyzing was whether these DNS query response sizes that we get actually remain the same, or they change within a very short period of time. So what we did was we took the subset of the web pages with anonymity set size equal to 1, and we ran the same experiment multiple times within a short span of time. And then we looked at the sizes of the queries and the responses. So here I'm just showing some sample plots just to show the kind of trends that we observe. So we categorize the trends in the sizes into three. So dominant category means that we see only one particular size value over all our experimental runs. And in a bimodal category, we see that there are two different packet sizes that we observe. And then we have the multimodal category where we can see multiple size values. So what we see is that as expected in the sent packet sizes, you do not see any variation. They belong to the dominant category because you're querying for the same web page over and over again. However, we see that in the received packet sizes, even though majority of the sizes belong in the dominant category, you do see differences. So you see the bimodal and the multimodal values. And then we looked at the responses in the API from this. So these experiments were conducted with Google's DNS over HTTPS API. So when we looked at the responses, we found out that there is a comments field in this API section. And this comments field includes some details such as which authoritative name server actually served the DNS response. So this comments field is not necessarily present in all of the DNS responses, and the name server that responded can also vary in the responses, and these lead to differences in the received packet sizes. Then we decided to see how the DNS data varies over a longer period of time. So we took the top, middle, and the bottom 500 web pages, and we performed the same experiment, but over about 39 days. And we looked at the, how many web pages actually show some changes in the packet sizes. And we found out that, so we categorized the changes into small changes, which could be changes in an IP address, for example, and large changes, which could have been caused by the presence or the absence of the comments field. And we found out, as expected, that there were web pages that show the variance over several days. In the initial days of the experiment, we actually found some large fluctuations. So there were a large number of web pages that showed a change greater than 10 bytes here. And we are not really sure as to why these fluctuations were caused. Maybe there was some error message which could have contributed to differences in the packet sizes. So we are still running the experiment to see if this behavior occurs again. So as I mentioned before, in our single query experiments, we were looking only at the first query and response. But in the next set, which we call browsing experiments, we look at all the data that are associated with a particular browsing session. So what we did was we set up Cloudflare's DNS over HTTPS client on the Raspberry Pi, and we used Selenium, which is a browser automation testing tool, with a Chrome driver to replicate a browsing scenario where the client visits a particular page. And we did the same sort of analysis where we looked at the sequences of the sent and the received packet sizes for all the DNS data. So for this, I have a much smaller set of web pages because these experiments are relatively recent and they are also more time consuming. And what we found out was that 98.9% of the web pages actually have unique tuples and can be individually identified. And the largest anonymity set size is only 22. We have also started trying to classify the web pages based on size and ordering information. So right now, we looked at a hidden marker model where we tried to classify sequences of sizes for a particular web page. So we created models for each web page, and then we have a test size sequence, and we try to see what is the probability that that sequence belongs to a particular web page's model. So at the moment, I have cross-validation results that show average accuracy for about 1,500 web pages. And we are also looking at the top N accuracy, which means that the correct result is present in the top 10 guesses of the classifier. So at the moment, our top one is about 29% accuracy, and the top 10 is 47%, which is not bad, but it's not amazing either. And I'll come back to that. So we look at the longitudinal study, and we see that this is over about 11 days, and we see there are large fluctuations in the number of packets that are being sent and received, and they follow a multi or a binomial distribution. And we are studying in more detail as to how there are variations in the number of packets as well as the size between web pages, as well as how the variations occur for a single web page. And these factors could have an impact on classification. We are also considering other classification models outside of the HMM and seeing whether we can extract higher level features than individual size sequences. We have also started a few other experiments. The first one is to study the impact of the client. So we vary the location of the client, and we see if that has an influence on the DNS data. And we also want to see if data that is trained on a particular location can be used on test data from another location. We also want to study the difference in DNS data between the mobile and the desktop environment, because different websites are optimized for mobile, so it could be different domain names. And we also want to study more realistic scenarios where we consider client-side and resolver-side caching. And finally, we want to compare our results with the DNS over TLS protocol, which is another protocol that also aims to provide encrypted DNS. And Cloudflare has released a DNS over Tor protocol recently, so we'd be interested in studying that further. And finally, we want to look into designing better countermeasures, which might include removing unnecessary data from the APIs, or maybe padding-based measures as well. And I guess the final question is, even if we do all these measures for DNS privacy, whether the rest of the ecosystem is ready for getting full privacy for the user. There are recently some improvements in TLS, for example, but it takes time, and I guess we'll have to wait and see. Thank you.
Okay. So we've got time for some questions and comments and discussion, and I'm going to hand it to Ian first, and then Tarek will go from there. Ian.
Okay. So two things. One, so on slide, I think 8 it was, you pointed out, obviously the observer can see the IP address just from the TLS, but they can also see the host name because it's in SNI until such time as ESNI rolls out, hopefully with 1.3, but maybe not even.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's important to block the leakage at every place, but blocking it, like right now, the easy attack is the observer, the attacker just looks at the SNI, but it's of course important to block, to stave off this information leak as well. So that's great. The question for countermeasures, so what do you think? Can you just do a simple padding scheme on at least the single queries? So I know your colleague Brian Ford just has a new paper with this spiffy new padding scheme that has lower overhead, and you might want to look at that. You probably have already, but that's just for the single query. So what do you think you could do? Like some websites will load 20 DNS names and some will only load 1 or 2.
Yep.
How do you think you should protect against?
So there were two things that we were considering. The first one is, as I mentioned, currently the responses in the API for a particular DNS query. So we want to know what parts of a DNS response are, first of all, unnecessary and which do not actually contribute to the functionality of DNS, and maybe think about removing the unnecessary parts and seeing if that leads to some kind of improvements. The second one is, like you mentioned, padding-based countermeasures. So in, I think, traditional website fingerprinting techniques, you do have padding-based countermeasures, and there are some works that show that they are not super effective because certain trends in the traffic, such as the burst behavior, for example, is still known. the thing is that DNS traffic could follow a little different pattern from normal website accesses. So we'd want to first implement padding-based countermeasures and see if it is it works for DNS as well. I think Carmela.
And there is.
Tarek's got two.
All right. I'm going to answer to Ian. So also Cloudflare, they have a pipeline of countermeasures. Sorry. Cloudflare also is thinking about putting more things on the encrypted tunnel, and one of the things they are thinking about is including the DNS request when you talk to the website, so that they also serve you the DNS domain, so everything would go on the HTTPS instead of going back to the resolver. So there are some things coming there in the pipeline, which we do the traffic analysis when they come there. But that's an option, for instance, to try to avoid all of this coming and going, is instead of going back to the DNS once you got the first domain, then that domain can tell you the IPs of all of the rest of the stuff that they're serving to you.
Okay, so Longcat of the Internet asks, if one visits one website, multiple requests to third parties will happen, likely. Their domains have to be resolved too. How about size of the anonymity set when paying attention to those combinations of DNS requests? So what they're saying is when you go to one domain, you're actually going to request third-party website, which also have to be resolved.
Yes.
So what's the effect of that on the anonymity set?
So we haven't specifically, so here I show the anonymity set, but we haven't specifically studied what is the difference between when you visit some kind of third-party resources and so. So right now we have implemented some logging to see what requests are being made, and that's something that we are planning to study further, but we haven't done that analysis yet.
Okay, another question from the internet. The DNS protocol itself asks, question, did you measure the effectiveness impact of DNS padding, RFC 7830, on your classifiers? Does it have a significant impact?
No, because we just started the classifier study. So first we have to have a good classifier that has better accuracy, and then after that we look at the padding measures.
Cool.
Probably a stupid question, but why do you look at DNS over HTTPS in preference to DNSSEC? And if that's not a stupid question, how would the results differ for DNSSEC?
So DNSSEC is for authentication and not encryption of the DNS. Yeah. But just to further elaborate, there are other protocols such as DNS over TLS, and then there's also DNS Crypt, which looks mainly at authentication but also does encryption. The reason that we are specifically focusing on DNS over HTTPS is because you have companies such as Google and Cloudflare that have released these solutions, so it looks like it might be gaining more widespread adoption at the moment.
So DNS is back with another question. So if you make DNS resolvers harder to identify, how much better would this make the traffic analysis race in favor of the user? So if you make the resolver harder to identify, the DNS resolver,
okay,
right? How much would this help in the traffic analysis arms race?
Identifying the resolver, you mean?
Yeah.
I guess, okay, I mean, like, I suppose, I'm not sure I understand the question perfectly, but I guess for Cloudflare, they have like a very distinctive IP, so it's easier to identify that requests are going to Cloudflare's IP, I guess, versus something like Google where the IP changes. Yeah, I guess it becomes easier to get the traffic associated with a particular IP. You can still see from the SNI, as he says, which resolver is currently being accessed from the TLS session with the resolver, but if the SNI is encrypted, then I guess the IP does kind of help identify the traffic going to the resolver.
Cool. I'll sneak in a question while I'm handing the the microphone to Aaron. So one of the challenges that I see here, Cloudflare is the central service for a lot of things, and they get to learn a lot.
Yes.
So encrypting the connection to Cloudflare when Cloudflare still gets to learn everything, and same with Google, seems like it might not be solving the biggest part of the problem. The biggest part of the problem is that the whole DNS infrastructure is way more centralized than people would like, and protecting the transmission to the place that spies on you is not the whole problem.
Yeah, I totally agree. I guess the question is whether you would prefer your ISP's DNS or a big corporation's DNS to reply to your DNS queries. So Cloudflare tries to portray themselves also as a trusted resolver. So they say that they're going to delete the DNS records or any kind of identifying information within 24 hours, and that they will have regular audits of the data to make sure that they're following the right procedures. But yeah, I mean, it's just a few big players at the moment that are.
Wouldn't it be cool to use technology to enforce the security?
So I have a question. This especially pertains to the single query case. It seemed like you were looking in a closed world. You had like 100,000 and then 500,000, and you had anonymity set sizes. That's within that set of 100,000 or 500,000 sites,
yes,
right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering if you could comment on the fact that there are way more than 500,000 domain names on the internet. I mean,
Yes.
maybe millions, I don't know, billions. So what can you really say, what can you really conclude about, especially a single query, the packet sizes, do you think?
Yeah, so I think I forgot to mention it in the talk, but we were also thinking of expanding the study to include an open world scenario where we would try to classify websites that are outside the ones that we've trained on as just unknown. I guess for the closed world, it might be useful in cases like censorship if you're looking at a specific set of websites and you're just looking at traffic analysis and you want to identify only those. But yeah, with an open world scenario, I think it becomes much harder.
How feasible would it be to do this test on all the domain names? It is a finite site, it's not that big.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that?
Yeah, so you mean the single query experiment? Because the browsing experiments will take a really long time, but the single query experiments, I think, yeah, I guess it depends on how many Raspberry Pis I have finally.
Okay, let's have the next person come and set up, and there's time for one more question while the next person is coming and setting up. You're stretching here. Okay, sounds good. Paul's got one.
So you talked about padding and stuff, and then you also mentioned Cloudflare's, DNS over Tor, and subject to Roger's very valid observation about, Cloudflare. I mean, Tor inherently does a degree of padding. Do you think that in general, I don't know how much of this like extra stuff they've been putting in these, but for single query, not the sequences, would that by itself be enough padding that they're all going to look the same for the single query DNS lookups? So Cloudflare has DNS over Tor, right? Tor packs to and from sides. So in a single lookup case, I don't actually know how big the DNS. I'm just repeating the her.
I think that we will go to anonymity instead of one or two. I think some of them are too long.
Anonymity set of one or two. We're going to let this one go offline rather than it was the short question that was. Thank you again. And next up, we've got Eric talking about browser level tracking.
TLS session resumption. Let me first answer the question, what is TLS session resumption? That is, when a connection, the cost of a TLS connection is compensated over multiple connections. Thus, the connection is conducted by exchanging an identifier, which is, and then both peers, they resume the previous symmetric key, and thus they gain temporal and computational performance gains. However, this leads always to a situation that a server can identify the client through the secret key. Thus, in my presentation now, the attacker is the server who is taking part in the TLS connection. TLS session resumption is very widely used on the internet. My measurements show that 96% of the TLS-enabled Alexa Top Million sites support session resumption. And Cloudflare or Google report that approximately half of all the new connections are established through TLS session resumption. So, what are the opportunities and limitations of tracking someone over TLS session resumptions? The opportunities compared to HTTP cookies or browser fingerprinting are that you get a much faster unique identification of a user. This might be especially relevant in scenarios like real-time online biddings, where the more time you spend on identifying a user, the less time you can spend on the bidding process itself. Furthermore, from an economical perspective, you have a lower consumption of bandwidth and computational resources on both sides, which is also attractive to the tracker, because you don't have to issue an additional request for the HTTP cookie or to send the browser fingerprinting script to the client. Limitations are, beside the obvious limitation that this tracking mechanism applies only for TLS connections, is that a browser restart terminates a tracking period. Thus, we need to investigate what is the actual uptime of a browser. And the tracking period is terminated because the TLS cache gets cleared within the browser restart. Furthermore, browsers apply countermeasures against this tracking mechanism, such as the Tor browser, which completely disabled session resumption. However, this also leads to performance reductions. Thus, in my evaluation, I investigate of 48 browsers the session resumption lifetime, and also how feasible it is to conduct a third-party tracking with those browsers. Those first have a look at the browser restarts. I access publicly available data of the Mozilla Foundation for their desktop and desktop and mobile browsers, and analyzed crash reports, 500,000 each. And this cumulative density function shows that the browser uptime usually, or for the majority of users, exceeds more than a single day. And that also the tracking period is over a single day. However, this is a very indirect measurement, thus take it with a grain of salt. And we see quite a lot of browsers which have an uptime of several days or even several weeks. My experiments to test the browser default configuration, there, as I already explained, I investigated 48 browsers and investigated the session resumption lifetime, which is like the maximum delay between two visits of a website where the browser still tries to establish the new connection over a session resumption mechanism. Furthermore, I investigated the feasibility of third-party tracking, like you can see in that figure. I first requested a website A, which included a third party, the third party tracker. Then I waited till the connections timed out, and then I requested a website B and observed how the browser established the new connection to the third party T, whether the browser applies TLS session resumption or whether the browser applies completely or a full new handshake, which does not allow to track the user. Here's a summary of my results for the most popular browsers. You see that Firefox and Safari allow tracking periods of 24 hours. And you see furthermore that third-party tracking is viable across the majority of browsers. Within the evaluation of all 48 browsers, only 6 browsers did not allow third-party tracking. Thus, Microsoft Edge is a real exception in this data set, which is caused through the sandboxing mechanisms. Thus, the question arises, is this tracking period now limited to 1 hour for Chrome and 24 hours for Firefox? I would say no. Because here you see a successful TLS 1.3 resumption handshake, and you see the PSK, the pre-shared key, and that is a session resumption mechanism used in this case. And you see that the client provides this identifier to the user, and after the handshake, the server provides a new PSK, a new identifier to the user, which the user will use in a future connection. And there it's not specified in the TLS specification. And also during our test we noticed that a lot of browsers are making a mistake and they reset the lifetime of that PSK. This allows to extend the tracking period. How do we evaluate this prolongation attack? I had the chance of using a DNS traffic log, which included more than 3,800 users over a 60-day period, and these data were pseudonymized. And then I tried to find out which tracking periods are feasible from a server perspective by observing, okay, when the user returns within a time period which is smaller than a given session resumption lifetime, how long does this tracking period become in a real-time, in a real-world scenario? Another evaluation I conducted is to estimate the share of permanently trackable user. That means the share of the user within my data set which can be identified throughout this 60-day period based on the TLS, or based on this prolongation attack. Here you see a plot about the feasible tracking periods for the median user within our data set. And you note that there's approximately a factor of 10 between the session resumption lifetime and the maximum tracking period. Furthermore, you note that when the session resumption lifetime exceeds 6 to 7 hours, then the maximum tracking period increases rather fast for longer session resumption lifetimes. Thus, it seems like this is a period for which users, like the night rest of a user, and when the session resumption exceeds this night rest, then we are going fast into a multiple day maximum tracking period, which is not plotted here, but given in the detailed values. For a session resumption lifetime of 24 hours, we get already 8 days of a tracking period. And for a session resumption lifetime of 48 hours, already 12 days tracking period. Thus, let's have a look on the permanently trackable user. we see that for a session resumption lifetime of a single day, there's only 1% of the users permanently trackable. However, when we increase the session resumption lifetime to 7 days, and please note that the TLS specification of TLS version 1.3 recommends as an upper limit session resumption lifetime of 7 days, we can permanently observe 65% of all users through this mechanism. Thus, I want to propose some countermeasures. The simplest countermeasure, as done through the Tor browser, is to deactivate session resumption. However, this has an impact on the performance. Thus, I propose that browser vendors should disable third-party tracking through sandboxing, like Microsoft Edge is doing it. Furthermore, they should reduce the TLS session resumption lifetime to a single page visit, which is approximately 10 minutes, or at most 6 hours. They should prevent a reset of the session resumption lifetime, thus that they prevent the prolongation attack. I would like to see that the TLS working group recommends a reduction of the upper lifetime limit in the draft of TLS 1.3. And I think it makes sense to recommend a measure to prevent a reset of the TLS session resumption time. There exist also countermeasures which do not rely on TLS session resumption to achieve zero round-trip time handshakes, especially semi-static Diffie-Hellman key establishment, such as proposed in OP TLS 1.3, or the recent draft Rescola TLS 1.3 semi-static Diffie-Hellman. They're going into that direction. However, if we want to apply these approaches, then we need to make sure that the public key is shared within an anonymity group. Thus, the conclusion is TLS session resumption is a realistic tracking mechanism which is widely supported and allows unique user identification with a very low bandwidth, computation and temporal overhead. And browser vendors and the TLS working group need to further restrict this privacy problem. Countermeasures are available, but they lead to a performance reduction. Thus, I thank you very much. And if you want to have a look at the slides, they are available there. And I also have a preprint article, which I can share per mail.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got one microphone, and I'm going to share it with Tarek. And we've got one question here.
So you say the countermeasures impact performance, but like how bad is it? Basically, how much typical session is slowed if you like for different for different of these countermeasures?
Okay, I have a backup slide on this. Like if you choose different session resumption lifetimes, what is the impact in regard of performance? Those, if we assume a session resumption lifetime of 5%, then 17.7% of the users, they still can conduct session resumption because the revisits occur sometimes very shortly after the initial visit. And there is not much benefit in choosing a TLS session resumption lifetime beyond 24 hours. Beyond 24 hours to 48 hours, you only get around about 6% increase in users. And does it answer the question? Or?
I mean, if you take just one session, what's the difference between having this, having this performance gain versus not having it if you have to regenerate a key? Like, if it's like this just so this is good information because it indicates how often the thing is useful, but the question was also like how useful is one single event, right?
Yeah, and I think the factor might be 100 to 1000 or something like the symmetric key establishment compared to a full handshake.
Hi. On slide 11, could you open it again? The last line reads public key is shared within an anonymity group. What does it mean?
That is these proposals, or like we also spoke about the recently published SNI encryption. There is a public key available, and you encrypt the first message with this public key. But if every user gets individual public key, then you can track these users based on these public keys. However, like it's currently done with QUIC, like Google's QUIC protocol, they use a public key, and this is shared within a large anonymity group, and you can use this public key, and cannot be identified so easily.
Hi, question from the internet. TTL asks, does TLS 1.3's zero RTT reduce the negative impact of disabling TLS session resumption?
Okay, can you repeat it please once?
So does TLS 1.3's zero RTT reduce the negative impact of disabling TLS session resumption?
The new TLS will have the ability to much more quickly do a TLS check, and therefore maybe disabling resumption is fine and safer and good enough.
Okay. Is this working? Yes. All right, thank you everybody for coming to the third session. Sorry? Yes, it is 3:11. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming to the third session of Hot Pets. Regardless of whether or not they offer deniability, these protocols are undeniably about communication. And so our first speaker is Ben, and he is going to talk to us about secure and private collaborative editing.
Thanks very much for that introduction. How's the volume on the mic? Okay, good. I'm going to talk just very briefly about myself. I work at a small liberal arts college, which is a kind of institution that I imagine some of you are not familiar with. We have 3 computer science faculty, no graduate students. My job is primarily teaching, but with a little bit of research. And I mention that only because I'm very interested in any sort of collaboration. In case anything I say here is interesting to anyone, I'm super happy. I don't need much research credit for my job, so I'm happy to give that away. I'd much rather see these ideas come to fruition in some sort of way. These are lovely pictures of Colorado. Also, I came to security and privacy relatively late in my research life, so if you think I'm missing anything, I'd really love to hear about that. Okay, so my goal is to make an architecture for building collaborative editing applications. These kinds of applications, of course, are very popular and useful for helping teams work together, play together, do all kinds of things together. But the way that almost all of these applications work in the world today is that the service provider has all your data. And I don't think it'll take much convincing in this crowd for me to say that this is kind of a problem, that the company, all their employees, malicious hackers, governments can get at your team's data pretty easily. This is not a great state of the world. So my goal is to enable those kinds of applications, nothing new there, but with better security and privacy. Step 1 is an idea that's been explored in a couple of research projects, and then I'll go into something a little bit new after that. So step 1 is to take the plain text data, the database, the document, whatever it is, and move it from the central server to the clients. And then the clients broadcast the edits to each other instead of sending them all to the central service to be integrated into a single document. And of course, we use some sort of end-to-end encrypted protocol for this, and you can use whatever your favorite end-to-end encrypted messaging is. And this sort of shape of idea is something that's been explored a couple of times. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any really widely deployed systems that use this. And I'm going to have a little bit of speculation later about why that might be the case. And technically, what I'm focusing on in my project is getting rid of this central server entirely. And why do I want to do that? Well, first of all, it makes metadata collection really easy. Nobody likes metadata collection. Second of all, it's relatively easy to block some sort of central service. So I'm thinking here of things like Telegram in Russia and Signal in lots of countries where somebody is trying to block the use of a service. It's relatively easy to do when there's some sort of central service provider. And then for the litigating part, I'm thinking about things like key disclosure laws. After the GDPR presentation this morning, I'm a little less confident that decentralizing the service actually means something legally, but I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. And then just expounding on those two ideas a little bit, in some sense, if you have somebody trying to run a collaborative editing system in this secure and private way, where they're providing the central infrastructure, they get kind of the worst of both worlds. They don't get the user's private data to sell, which of course is what a lot of them want, but they still get the cost of paying AWS or whoever it is, and whatever risks there are associated with having people's data, even if it's only in an encrypted form. Okay, so how do we decentralize this? Before I talk about my technical idea, I just want to talk a little bit about the kinds of users and uses that I'm imagining, because I think there are lots of ways that you could try to attack this, and so I'm going to try to motivate the particular way I'm going at it. I know that many people here think a lot about users with heightened privacy concerns, and that's not what I'm interested in so much. I'm more interested in old people and Luddites who just want to use the internet in a, maybe sensitive, maybe not so sensitive kind of way, and I don't like that, Google and the government and everybody is vacuuming up all this data. So that's the main group I'm thinking about. I can hear some of you rolling your eyes at me because, of course, regular people don't care about privacy, and fueling my hope just a tiny bit. This is a different area, of course, but this is a graph from Let's Encrypt, and they made it almost as easy to do HTTPS as HTTP. And hey, lo and behold, more HTTPS. So I'm hoping that if good, secure, and private collaborative editing is just as easy as the regular kind, then hey, maybe some people will shift over to that. So based on those assumptions about the kind of uses and users, I'm thinking about what does that mean technically. So it means two things for me. One, I'm assuming that these users have some kind of client computer. I'm not yet thinking about what if you only have a feature phone. That's for future work. Everybody's got a computer, but they might be connected to the internet only intermittently. So a protocol where we're assuming they have some kind of online communication for sharing the data is not going to work for what I'm trying to do. We need something else in the system to store the data for the users to communicate with each other. So the other piece that I'm assuming is that they have some kind of commodity cloud storage account. And so then the users are going to upload their edits, encrypted of course, to their own commodity cloud storage account, and then their teammates will monitor everybody else's cloud storage account to get those edits and then integrate them into their own copies of the team's database or document or whatever it is. Okay, now just super briefly, what are the biggest technical challenges that I've come across in trying to implement this? The first one is concurrent editing conflicts. Of course, in any decentralized system, you can run into concurrent editing conflicts. And so the way I'm trying to solve that is that the core data model is that each user has their own chain of edits they've made to the team's data, and they upload that to their own cloud storage account with some sort of distinguished root file pointer. And then everybody else is responsible for monitoring those, and then there's some sort of atomic broadcast protocol that I'm still working on to hopefully get everybody to agree on how those edits should be interleaved in time. This is kind of classic distributed systems stuff, but my assumptions about the system are a little bit weird. This is pretty different from like normal database replication in warehouse computing and that kind of thing. So sort of classic, but with a little bit of a twist. And then finally, when I talk about the data model being this accumulation of little edits, Some of you might be worrying, oh, that's going to be really limiting, like Bitcoin, which is accumulation of little edits, but the data model there is very limited, or really inefficient. If you just have a simple log file where you accumulate data, then querying that later is going to be super inefficient. I'm using this cool little database called Datomic as my model, which is engineered from the ground up to deal with the sort of accumulation of little edits model, but it does a very general purpose database that actually has pretty good efficiency properties in most cases. So, in summary, my goal is to make an architecture for collaborative editing systems that allow you to do any kind of collaborative editing that you want, but with better security and privacy than current systems. The key idea is that users broadcast chains of edits to each other by uploading to their own commodity cloud storage account. And then there are a handful of technical details that are a little bit gnarly that need to be ironed out along the way. And my current prototype is some of the way towards implementing this. I'm not done, but seeming reasonably feasible so far. So thanks for your attention. And I was told to prepare suggested discussion questions, so.
Great. Thanks. We'll take questions now.
So there are two possibilities. Why couldn't you use something like SpiderOak and a joint account that doesn't do the simultaneous editing nicely? It does do editing, but each person, so SpiderOak, the keys are on the client device. They're not, data is stored in the cloud encrypted. And so, and then as you were talking, I looked up and there's a product out of Switzerland that has good reviews that seems to do the thing you want, Treesort. Have you looked at it? I don't know anything about it. I've been using SpiderOak for a long time.
Did you say Treesort?
I've been using SpiderOak for a long time and been happy with it.
Okay.
Treesort, Tresorit.
Yeah, super coincidentally, I actually met one of the founders of Treesort in Hungary.
Okay.
So, to the best of my knowledge, Treesort is really pretty conventional file storage, and so I'm not aware that they can do a more fine-grained kind of application, but I might be wrong about that.
Okay. But SpiderOak, you could do it.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look into that more.
So SpiderOak is worth looking at. Now
Okay.
they don't directly support editing, but of course you could do that way. You could do the editing if you're not planning for simultaneous editing. If you're
Well, I do want to support simultaneous editing
Okay.
for sure.
literally simultaneous.
Literally simultaneous.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, part of the Atomic Broadcast Protocol is that there can be simultaneous edits and then they get merged.
Hi. We've done some work in this space. So we have a demo of Trello working in this editing kind of mode. So we should perhaps catch up after your talk to talk in detail how that works. So conflict-free replicated data types is like another alternative algorithmic solution in this kind of space, which is what we've been exploring, which is, I think, complementary to your kind of system.
Yeah, CRDTs are interesting, and I don't know if I just have not thought creatively enough about them, but they feel somehow limited to me, that you can make a set or a map or whatever, but that's not a complete application. So I'd be very curious to talk about.
Sure. So we support basically JSON, so you can have nested lists of maps and lists of maps, maps of lists, and so on, and then represent text as a ordered list of characters, that kind of thing. Anyway, we can catch up later.
Yeah, just in case anyone's curious, the thing I get hung up on there is that if you define that protocol for how to do the merging at the system level, then you leave out the application semantics. And so, okay, you've got a set, but if you're merging the set, do you really want to put both of them in there, or do you want to define that as a real application semantic level conflict? And so the system that I'm working on, each transaction can have a precondition, just a totally arbitrary function. And when the users are then trying to merge them, that can fail. So anyway.
Sure. Okay.
Hi, great talk, by the way. And this reminds me a lot of good old CouchDB. I don't know if you heard about it, and their model of like having a database on each of your devices and all of that. And so one of the problems that when I was considering using CouchDB was how do we broadcast if, for example, I make an edit, but then I'm offline for a while, and then you make your edit, and then you're offline for a while. And then I make another edit, and like, when do we synchronize? For example, if we have 3 separate devices, like, chances are that we don't, like, at the same time be together for like a long time, for example.
Yeah, so the way that my prototype system is working is that users upload their own edits to their own cloud storage. So you can work offline if you want, but then of course you're not going to be synchronizing with anyone. And then you upload your edits, and then there's a kind of implicit obligation. I'm assuming that within a team, people are working cooperatively. There's no adversariality within a team. And when you go online, you're obligated to download your teammates' edits before you try to upload your own. And so then you have an opportunity to see if there are any conflicts that have arisen there. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. But isn't that like, if you are uploading it to a cloud storage, are you not centralizing it somehow? Because then, even if it's your own storage, like you're depending on a central server somehow of sorts, right?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely interesting questions about how much the system trusts the cloud storage. Of course, everything is encrypted and signed, so without breaking that, they don't get the team's information, but it would be trivial for the cloud storage provider to do denial of service, and they could try to be fancier about that and just make little modifications or whatever. And that's true. So it's possible that piece of the decentralization, I'm not sure how much it buys you, or I'm not sure what scenarios exactly it buys you a lot in. I have worked to keep the sort of API between the storage API extremely simple. So it wouldn't be conceptually very hard to go to some sort of crazy P2P cloud storage something or other if you were concerned about an attack from the cloud storage provider.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. We actually also have worked a little bit on the topic, and the one issue which we faced, or the challenge which we found the most difficult, was access control. How do you remove people to the team or add them? Have you looked into it already, and do you have any ideas?
Yeah, the only thing I've done so far is quite simple, which is that so the meta information about who's in a team is part of the team database itself. And as you invite new people to the team, that gets updated, and anyone can remove someone from the team whenever they want to. And effectively, that just forks the future of that team, and they will no longer make their edits available to those users. And the other people on the team can agree with that or not. And it could get messy, potentially, but anyone can choose not to give the necessary keys to anyone else if they want to remove them from the team.
But essentially, all your updates are one-to-one. So you encrypt the same, like, edit for every single member of the group, right?
Yes. Yeah. Technically, you upload each edit once with a symmetric key, and then send that key to each of your teammates with a different. Yeah.
With accumulate only data model, how does write to erasure works? It seems like even if all of the participants in the centralized system are like honest and so on, they can't delete stuff. Isn't that like scary?
Oh, so you're worried about the kind of the database model, and it's this accumulation, and data never goes away. It is possible to expunge data from the database, and that just means you've got this chain, but underneath it's really a tree. And it is possible to actually remove something. You need to add another transaction on the tree that says delete the data from transaction, and then it makes a new tree that is then missing that data. It's a little, performance-wise it's not great, but it is possible to actually remove. It's not the default operation mode, but it is possible.
About 5 minutes left for questions. I'd like to ask a question, actually. You have this performance bullet point here. Okay. And so when I think of collaborative editing, that seems to encompass a lot of different kinds of scenarios, some of which are like maybe these last minute group of people working on a project, but it could also be longer term maintenance of some shared collaborative resource. Do you have any thoughts on maybe what types of things this would be used for, or kind of like different scenarios that would require different performance?
Sure, yeah, in the short term, where the cloud storage is the only medium for communication, that definitely puts a limit on the performance. Getting something up to Google Drive or Dropbox or whatever, and then somebody else observing that is optimistically around a second and can easily be like a minute. So we're definitely not talking about low latency sorts of applications with that infrastructure. So the kinds of applications that I've been imagining, so for the first one is a chore recorder, where a family or a team or whatever can get together and say, hey, we want to do these things, and you just click a button and say, hey, I walked the dog, or I did the dishes, or whatever. Or keeping a calendar or an address book amongst a team is a similar one where latency is not especially critical. I thought a tiny little bit about using WebRTC if two users happen to be online simultaneously, and using that as an alternative communication mechanism, but I've not implemented that at all yet.
Any other questions, comments? I know there's ice cream next. We were talking about maybe you have to ask a question before you get ice cream.
That doesn't count.
What's your favorite flavor, though?
What's my favorite flavor? Let's go with mint chocolate chip.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Just a quick announcement before, while the other speakers set up. I've been informed that there's...
We're still recovering from our technical difficulties earlier. All right, awesome. So So on Tuesday, we had the mainstream PETS version of Secure Communication Protocols, and now we have the HOTPETS version of with OTR v4. So now Ola and Sophie are going to present this.
Yeah, hello everyone. You can hear us? Perfect. Okay, yeah, so my name is Ola, and this is Sophie, and we work for a NGO in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Yes, the statistics this morning was wrong. We were from the other part of the world. We work for an NGO that is quite new called Centro de Autonomia Digital, and we basically main purpose is to work on pets, actually building them in real life. So this is definitely a follow-up, a sequel to the talk from Tuesday about taking some of the advances in deniable authenticated key exchanges and improving the OTR protocol.
Okay, so the first thing, can you hear me clearly? Hello. Okay, great. Okay, so one of the first things that we wanted to talk about into this talk that we're having is to give an overview of what OTR is, just in case someone in the audience doesn't know what OTR is, which I assume that most of the people here know. But if you don't know and you want to know, right now is your time. Okay, so what is OTR? OTR stands for off the record, and it's a cryptographic protocol that is used for secure messaging in general. It was first proposed in a paper, the paper that is quoted on the slide, that was made by at least two people that are right now on the audience, which is Ian Goldberg, Nikita Borisov, and also Eric Weaver. Okay, so where does the idea of OTR comes from? The idea of OTR comes from an idea from investigative journalism. In investigative journalism, you have this concept of off the record. And what does this mean? By an example is, for example, if I'm a source that wants to show some confidential information of a company that I work for, and I want to go and talk to a journalist about that so they can publish an article around this, I would probably say to the journalist, hey, I want to keep this, the fact that I talked to you about this information, I want to keep it off the record because maybe I will have some kind of legal trouble, or maybe I will get fired from my work if they found out that I was the person who actually disclosed this information. And the journalist will go ahead and say, yes, we will keep this off the record. And when they publish the story, there's no link that says that I, as the source of information, actually was the person who leaked this information. And this property is often defined as the deniability that I have because I can deny having actually said that information. And we wanted to also have on the digital world because because what actually happens is in that real world conversations of the real world, we often have this property. Why we have this property? For example, if I'm talking with someone in the real world and this person later says, oh, Sophie, go ahead and said this information in our conversation, I can go and say, no, I didn't say that. I can deny having said that information because no one else can actually prove that I said this into this conversation. And actually, no one can really hear what's been talking about in a real world conversation. No one really knows what has been said. No one really knows who participated into this conversation. No one really knows if this conversation actually took place. But we know that in the digital world, this really sometimes doesn't happen because we have traces that this conversation actually took place between two participants and that some information was exchanged between them. If they're using encryption in this digital conversation, we at least don't know the exact contents of the conversation, but if they don't use encryption, we even know what the conversation was about. So OTR stands there for providing secure communication, for providing perfect forward secrecy, for providing deniability properties, so we can have conversations as in the real world. It has been several versions of the OTR protocol, 3 versions, and right now we're presenting version 4.
Right, so when we started working on OTR version 4, there were a lot of different things that we wanted to achieve. We started out thinking very small in terms of, it would be nice to have elliptic curves and maybe changing some of the domain parameters a little bit. But then, of course, Nick came and he created some very interesting new AKAs, and he kept improving them. So we've actually been working on this for a while, and every time we thought we were getting close, we got a paper from Ian and Nick about okay, so we changed a few things, and now it's even more cool. And it's very tempting to keep doing this process, but now hopefully we think that we are at the coolest level possible with these stakes. Exactly. Yeah, so in terms of the features that we are interested in, deniability is of course the biggest one here. OTR, like Sophie was talking about, the whole idea of OTR is that we want the same kind of deniability that we experience in the real world. And I'm sure that we might come back to this during the discussion later, whether deniability is valuable or all this stuff. Our position is that deniability should be the default, and that we should justify why we want to go away from deniability, not why we want to have deniability, at least as long as deniability doesn't cost us too much. Now, there are many different types of deniability we are interested in, and when it comes to OTR version 4, the 4 types of deniability we are focusing on is participation deniability, as in we want it to be impossible to produce a proof to someone else that we actually had the conversation. Message deniability, which is that one party cannot produce a proof that something specific was said. Online deniability and offline deniability. And online deniability was covered during Nick's talk, and offline deniability is what has been traditionally called deniability without any qualifier. Privacy, of course, we're at PETS. I guess this is pretty obvious. We also want to make sure that OTR version 4 has as good forwards, backwards, future, and yeah. Damn it, I put in the perfect. I don't want the perfect in there because that term is interesting. But yeah, future, forwards, and backwards, and yeah. I was proposing we need a new Back to the Future for secrecy model as well, but no one is taking me up on that yet. We also want to change the security level because at the end of the day, OTR version 3 is roughly at the level of 80 bits of security level, and that's starting to feel very uncomfortable today. If you're thinking about what causes that, that's actually the DSA, the DSA, which uses 1024-bit keys, which actually is not really a comfortable security level anymore. And of course, the cryptographic primitives that are used are all kind of a little bit old, the DSA and old-style Diffie-Hellman and so on. And yeah, we also, at the end of it, when we decided that we want to lift the curves, we're going to come back to a few more of the choices in a second, but we also decided that we did want to have some classic Diffie-Hellman built in as well in order to protect against a possibility of quantum computers breaking elliptic curves significantly faster than classic Diffie-Hellman because of the difference in key sizes. And yeah, the final point here is we want elliptic curves. Because of speed, because of security levels, and all these different features.
Okay, another thing that we talked a lot about when we were developing the specification of OTR was thinking about the new communication models that there are. Previously, the previous versions of OTR had only in order network model, and right now we're thinking that we should have both network models, in order and out of order, and we should also support online and offline messaging, because the truth is, in the real world, we most of the time communicate not only when both parties are online, but also when parties are offline. So now we also have support of that in OTR before. We also want different modes in which the specification of OTR can be implemented, and this is something that we aim because implementers sometimes have a different scenario in mind from which was different from the one that was specified when you wrote the protocol. So for example, let's take the example of OTR before. If, for example, an implementer only wants to implement OTR before interactively, they can go ahead and see the guidelines for implementing this interactively. If they want to implement this so it's compatible to OTRv3, they also have the guidelines for doing so. And we also don't want to trust servers. Why? Because we want that the security properties that we provide with OTR before work by themselves, not because we have to trust a server or because we have to trust that it goes well or we have to trust something else. We want that they go well even if the server is untrusted.
Just to mention one additional point here. This puts us in a slightly awkward position, as we will see a little bit later, because we do want to support offline conversations. At the same time, we don't want to trust servers. So OTR version 4 does have an optional server component in order to support offline communication, but we've tried to minimize the trust, and in fact, this server is completely untrusted, and the only kind of attack that should be possible from it is denial of service, which is possible in several other scenarios anyway. So this trust in the server to not denial of services is kind of the minimal that we could find that still matches these communication models.
Okay, and just in case you were wondering also, well, all of these changes and security properties are stated. We have a protocol on GitHub where you can read it. If you have forgotten by right now which security properties we were talking about, you can go ahead and read them. And it basically looks like this.
Right,
Okay.
so let's go through a few specific examples here, just to be specific. First of all, we ended up using two different of the deniable authenticated key exchanges from Nick's paper, DAKEZ and XADH. And we use these instead of the very common these days, X3DH AKE that Signal uses, or the Sigma model that OTR version 3 uses. It's not exactly Sigma, but it's close enough. Now, the reason for this, the primary reason that we chose these two DAKEs is because they give us online deniability. They're significantly stronger, and they're also proven in the random oracle model. And we ended up with two different DAKEs because one of them gives us slightly stronger deniability properties if both participants are online at the same time. That's when we use DAKEZ. If one of the parties is offline, we use XCDH. And the reason for this is because XADH only gives you online deniability to one of the parties, while DAKEZ gives online deniability to both parties. And this is also the reason why this idea of modes of implementation is important, because in some cases, under some circumstances and for some implementations, it might not be acceptable to trade off the online deniability of one of the parties by supporting offline messaging. On the other hand, there were several other choices for offline messaging where, for us, XADH was the best trade-off in terms of speed and security properties. We've also chosen not to go with the standard Bernstein using ED25519 as our curve of choice. Instead, we're using Mike Hamburg's Goldilocks curve, or also known as ED448. For us, we found that ED448 gives us a little bit more latitude when it comes to the security level. It has a very comfortable 224 bits level, and we felt when it comes to the question of security properties for a primarily human interactive protocol, adding a few bits to the security level doesn't really make that much of a difference when we're talking about the kinds of speeds that you have to interact with as the end user. We also, and this is what I mentioned before, we do have in the ratchet, and yeah, sorry, these are coming in random order in my head, it feels like. We have a ratchet, and in that ratchet, the main ratcheting is done using the 448 Goldilocks curve. However, we are also mixing in the Diffie-Hellman 3072-bit prime Diffie-Hellman exchange every third ratchet in order to do this kind of countermeasure against fast quantum attacks. We have changed the main hashes to Shake and the main symmetric algorithm to XSalsa20. Shake, it's quite simple. It's because we want the 256 level hash, and Shake is what's used in ED448 implementations by standard. XSalsa20 is a little bit more of an interesting choice. This one is because it's a fast symmetric cipher that also has a 256-bit block size, which matches our other security parameter choices. Yes, and of course, the old OTR version 3 and earlier was one of the earlier protocols that implemented a ratcheting algorithm. This was later taken on in TextSecure and Signal to create the double ratchet algorithm. We have adopted the double ratchet algorithm roughly more or less the same as how Signal is implementing it. There is a significant difference in how the double ratcheting is initialized, where Signal uses the ephemeral keys exchanged during the AKE in order to initialize the double ratchet. This is something that we don't feel comfortable doing, and we're currently figuring out exactly what the right approach is, looking deeply at Nick's proof and discussing this back and forth. For us to be able to have full participation deniability, we have introduced something called client profiles. Client profiles are also necessary for us to support offline messaging. And the client profiles is one of the pieces that we publish to this pre-key server that we talked about earlier. The client profile is also necessary in order to make it possible for someone to create their first key and publish it somewhere, so that the first time it's used in an ache, it's not actually a proof that a participation that someone participated somewhere. And yeah, non-interactive. This ended up being based on the XADH and having a pre-key server that provides for pre-key, both a shared pre-key and also single pre-key messages that make it possible to initiate a conversation with someone that is offline. We did adopt the design where we have both a shared pre-key and a unique pre-key, an ephemeral pre-key, in order to stop the deniability attacks that Nick was talking about against the older version of the, is that the 3DH or XDH? XDH, sorry. We also provide a toolkit, and the toolkit allows you to do all the forging operations. So the OTR version 4 specification contains operations for forging. We specify that an implementation should actually provide all these forging capabilities to the end user, so that the deniability is not just a theoretical concept that someone could implement, it's something that is actually there in the code base. Just like with OTR version 3, all of the forging that we talked about, you can actually do on your own with tools that we provide. Now, there are two main limitations that you can see here. The first one is that we are not putting in any post-quantum algorithms yet. The reasoning for this is basically we feel that it's not clear which algorithms there is a consensus on, and there is also a lack of good implementations that we feel are stable enough that we can base our specification on them. The idea behind OTR version 4 is that we create a specification that makes it easy to upgrade. So when the time comes around for us to put in a post-quantum algorithm, we should be able to flip the switch, upgrade to version 5, make very small changes to the spec, and that should be it. So we've been trying quite carefully to make the spec as easy as possible to upgrade going forward, and this is also true for the implementation. Finally, group chats. We felt like the alternatives when it comes to group chats were quite complicated. At the same time, especially when we come to group chat that fulfill the same security properties or similar security properties that we are interested in for one-to-one or peer-to-peer conversations inside of OTR. We felt that adding any of those kind of group chat protocols right now would have complicated the protocol to a significant degree, and would also have added an element of insecurity in the protocol as well. So our idea is that once something nice comes out that fulfills the same or similar properties, this should come out as a sibling protocol, a complementary protocol, instead of being part of the same protocol.
Okay, so how does OTR look like? We basically stay with the same architecture this architectural design that OTR v3 already had, but we changed the cryptographic primitives that we use in it. So basically at the start of OTR, as we all know, we will have an advertisement of what version you are supporting, and if you support OTR, and if the other party actually supports the version that you are advertising and supports OTR, then you will start the OTR protocol in a secure messaging way. After that, you can verify the fingerprints of the party by doing a manual fingerprint verification, for example. Then the deniable authenticated key exchange starts, and why this starts? Because we need to generate a shared secret in order to start the double ratchet algorithm. And we also need to really know that we're talking with the participant that we want to talk, but no one else should be able to know that you're talking exactly to that person. Only the people that are having the conversation and are doing the take are the people that knows that you are talking to the right person, but anybody outside doesn't know this fact. After that, of course, we're going to start the conversation, and the conversation gets encrypted with the double ratchet algorithm, which generates a message key per message. And you can also have TLVs, which is type-left values, which advertise other functionalities that you can have in the OTR protocol. And if you want to finish the conversation in OTR, you just send a finish and you finish.
Just the TLVs contain the same functionality as older OTR, so we support the extra symmetric key, we support SMP, the Socialist Millionaire Protocol, using the same primitives that we've chosen in the rest of the protocol.
Okay, now for the...
Do we have a question, Ian?
Yeah, go back one.
Okay, sorry.
So verification, what's that step?
It can be, for example, the manual fingerprint verification, if you want.
So in OTR v3 and earlier, that happens after the date.
Oh yeah, that's true. Sorry. Yeah, it's after the date.
Oh, it's after the
yes.
date.
It's kind of like, it can also be on the side, you know, a human interaction where people
Yes.
compare on paper and so on. So verification as a step is either part of the SMP or it's a human thing that isn't actually mediated by the protocol.
Okay.
Okay, now for what we wanted to show you, most importantly. We have a real-world implementation, a production-ready implementation that has been written in C. We have the library, we have also the implementation of the Prigi server in Golang, we have the implementation of the Pidgin plugin. Why we think it's important to have an implementation of a protocol? Because oftentimes when you do some research, you have an implementation that sometimes doesn't run on one operating system, it doesn't compile on all compilers, or it doesn't run on all. And we wanted to provide, with a real-world protocol, we wanted to provide a real-world implementation that could work on most of the operating systems, most of the compilers, and that can just run when an implementer wants to run. And this is one of the insights that we have in OTR before. And we also wanted to provide the implementers an example of how you can implement this by doing, for example, a plugin for a real-world chat client as Pidgin. Because we're working in C, I'm sorry.
So we only have a limited amount of time, and we
Yeah,
want to leave some time for questions. So I'll give you like 1 minute, and then
Okay,
we'll take
because we're working in C, we had a lot of memory things that we wanted to check, so we have a lot of checkers. If you want to check them out, we have the protocols in GitHub, you can check them all out. They are part of the security and privacy community. If you want to find an attack in OTR before, go ahead and find it so we can improve the protocol. If you want to read something around it or one of the decisions of why we make this protocol, it's there, go ahead and read it. If you want to collaborate implementing this, please let us know. The protocol is as yours, as ours, as it is yours, so go ahead.
Yeah, and part of the specification is also what we call what's called ADRs, architectural decision records, and that's for all the major decisions we made. We've also documented the reasoning behind the decisions, and those are documented outside of the specification, but they're part of the repository.
Okay, thanks. So questions, I guess.
In North Syria, there's a Kurdish movement, YPG, who are fighting against ISIS, who went and captured and made genocide and all this thing. And all of the people in that I know from that movement that I communicate with, they can't use Pidgin. I tried, like Jabber, XMPP, Pidgin. It's far too complicated. All of them use Signal. And my worry is that all of this research kind of just end up becoming like a thing that we use. And it's not just this product, it's in general.
So yes, that's completely true, and that's a significant problem. When it comes to Pidgin, one of our plans going forward as part of the plugin work, we are going to do some usability work on the plugin once we have the basic functionality working. Our team is also behind another instant messaging client called Koion, which is built to be from the ground up, have the right security choices so that you don't have to actually make any choices. It should be as secure as possible coming out, and we are also going to support OTR version 4 in this. And the idea is for these kind of situations that would be the kind of client that you can give people. It should just start up and work.
But we should also remember that OTI is not linked to any messaging protocol. If you want and you are implemented and you want to implement OTR version 4 in another context or with another client, you can go ahead because the protocol is yours to go and implement. So if you feel you need OTR for mobile phones and you want to do an application for that, you can have that because that's the idea of OTR that works out of the box in every messaging protocol that you have.
Okay, thanks for working on this, and also thanks for making a toolkit for forging deniability and messaging. It's really a neat idea because we don't have this. So my concern, I guess, is like the question is the main drawback of OTR, previous versions of OTR, is a usability concern because it's like a text protocol, text-based protocol that runs over everything, and most of the users end up at like not encrypting their messages at all. So like, how do you see? As I can see, you still using. You still using this kind of text format for like bridging all the XMPP running over everything. But yeah, how do you get to the point when you encrypt all the messages by default without even letting users know that they have to do something? So like, how do you see usability perspective of OTR, and like how are you going to deal with it? Thanks.
That's a very broad and big question. I agree with you that that's what we really want. We want as much of this as possible to not be in the face of the user. But our work here is first and foremost to make it possible to actually have a good deniable messaging protocol for implementers to build those kind of systems on top of.
Yeah, so also usability sometimes is linked with the kind of client that you're working on. So if the client has, for example, its own usability properties, sometimes you plug OTR on that usability properties that this client have. That said, I think we still have a lot of work that we can do in OTR for usability matters. And this is something that I recommend everybody here that are researchers. If you want to research around how to do a better usability in OTR before, you can go ahead and do for that. Because right now we're just wrapping up all of the OTR work as a protocol, as an implementation. The next step, logically, will be to start working in usability. So we will take those concerns in the usability work.
Yeah, just okay. Thanks. The quick note is: do you like expect some kind of infrastructure for this messaging, like some kind of messaging service that will be like by default? For example, like Signal. Like, people don't have to think about XMPP, about other transport, and like how to plug these things together.
I mean,
like, do you expect this kind of infrastructure?
So OTR is designed by default to be usable on any network protocol, and that is a very careful choice. We don't want to lock it to a specific implementation, and we definitely don't want to lock it to a centralized implementation like Signal. OTR has been a little bit associated with XMPP, but it does run on anything. But at the end of the day, this is also kind of, at the end of the day, this is something that people higher up in the stack needs to make the decision. We're making it as easy as possible to use OTR on any of those situations, but we also don't have the resources to recreate all the clients and the infrastructure necessary on top of that. That might be something for the future. I would love to do that, but that's not something that we can tackle in the OTR work itself.
But the idea is the possibility, you have the possibility of doing that if you want, because OTR is not linked, OTR before and OTR in general is not linked to anything. You can have it, you can take it and implement it in what you want.
Okay, thanks.
So just great work. I hope we look forward to seeing Nick's report and your report on the MLS mailing list, because we've had this problem where everyone got stuck with Signal for a while, which didn't have an open standard, was centralized, and it's just been a mess. Looks like we're finally sorting that out. It would be a bit sad if the open source community went one way and everyone else went another way, when we finally might have the chance to have like a standardized good group messaging protocol. But however, in terms of something completely different, most of the usability failures for deniability have actually not been on the protocol level, and it was a real big failure in OTR, as came out during the Chelsea and Lamo's work, which is that at least early versions of Pidgin, at least when I was using them, had this horrible feature where they would like basically keep your fully deniable, cryptographically deniable transcript like on your client device by default. And I think so even if it's sort of indent encrypted and the sort of the cryptography is deniable, essentially if everyone's walking around with actual transcripts, that's a terrible thing. Because most people didn't even know those transcripts were turned on. They were assuming they were in these like super high secret conversations, and then those transcripts would be seized. You see the same phenomenon with Signal, where someone turns on disappearing messages, but it really only works on one way effectively. So the old messages, you can't force deletions of previous messages on God knows whose devices. So I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts on like this sort of usability and making deniability and things that most ordinary end users would kind of associate with deniability, such as no transcripts, available and usable to high-risk users.
So there are a few different points to unpack there. The first one is that when it comes to the Lamo Manning case, of course, this was not an accident. Adrian Lamo kept transcripts on purpose. This was not something that happened by chance. This is on purpose, and it was maliciously done. Secondly, you have the question that comes back to, from a judicial standpoint, should a text file that has no cryptographic authentication associated with it actually serve as evidence? I mean, I personally don't believe that that makes sense, but on the other hand, we are in a society right now where most of the judicial system does think that this makes sense. My hope is that that will change, and we're trying to lay the groundwork for a world where that's possible by having these kind of protocols where actually there is no such cryptographic proof, in contrast to, for example, PGP. And then the final part of this is, I do think that clients and usability of clients do have a responsibility. And once again, this is where, if you look at, for example, Tails, when you open Tails, you have a Pidgin that has been heavily customized. It does not save logs by default. It tells you that it's not saving logs. And it's made a lot of different choices. It puts each one of your circuits to a different Tor circuits by using the username password trick on SOX5, and it does a bunch of these other things. The problem is that Pidgin, when you download it by default, most people will download it and run it on their Windows machine, and then you will have to remember to do all these like 20 or 30 steps. And that was one of the motivating factors of, I was teaching security and operational security to groups of people, and I kind of got tired of teaching them all the 20 steps they had to take to actually make Pidgin work in a reasonably secure way. And this was one of the motivations, once again, behind our chat client, Koyen. And so we, as a group, are very interested in this problem. It is a problem that has to be at the client side, because as you say, this is not really related to the protocol itself.
For questions. If you want to talk to Ola and Sophia, you can do so during the ice cream break, but let's first thank the speakers again.
Yes. Useless here. Useless here.
We're gonna, since we're starting, we're kind of late. Ice cream is until 5 p.m. So you have lots of time to eat ice cream. It is downstairs, down the stairs, in the patio. It's outside. And yeah, be back for 5 p.m. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I know people here in Spain and in Germany, but I don't know any. Yeah, but we can definitely keep it in mind. Okay. Yeah, I mean, what we try to do with CAD is we're actually trying to build a work that implement and work on different things. So we have different things on. So actually our main goal right now is finding people, but our idea is also we want to use these people to do interventions and help different other groups. So I do think that there's also, it doesn't have to be a hiring model where you Orion hires their people. I think that there is a possibility for collaboration with just to be clear here, what I was saying was not a model where you pay us. This is a model where if what you're doing is interesting enough, we would not take any payment, and we would just work on the existing project. We've done this together with Tor, we've done this together with
just hoping that everybody will be so everyone have an internet. Yes. Just whoever wins by like points or whatever. Exactly. Let's see. Okay, so do you have a user? Send me an email with your thing. Let me see my emails. Have I got internet connections? I'm connected, but which email address did you send it to? Ladies and gentlemen, I got your email. Yes. I see. Sure.
All right, if you could, people at the doorway, if they could come in and take their seats, and if we could finish our conversations, we're going to begin the final session of Hot Pets. So if everybody could come in. So we started a little bit late, but we're giving the speakers the full 25 minutes for talks, or 15 minutes for talks and 10 minutes for discussion. Just a final reminder, there will be a Best Talk Award, so keep in mind to start thinking about who you might vote for the Best Talk Award. There'll be a quick vote at the end, and then that award will be given. Okay, so to start, the first speaker will be Alexander Hicks, who will be talking about evidence.
This works. Okay, so I'm Alex. You can see my full name on the screen. And I'm going to talk about evidence, which is a topic that I've kind of started discussing and working on with my advisor, Stephen, and both of us at UCL. So evidence is kind of a pretty general term. It comes up in a lot of situations. There's a couple keywords you can see on the slide now. And you have kind of like the lawful definition of evidence, where obviously you're familiar with court cases, people bring in evidence to try and convince a judge and so on. And even here we've had some discussions about things like non-repudiation, or rather like having repudiation in some cases. Being able to verify evidence is kind of verifying proofs is a common cryptographic thing, integrity of data and so on. And there's even, I stuck in some small kind of like Bayesian idea of evidence with, probabilities if P of A given E is bigger than P of A, then E is evidence for A. There's kind of a lot of different notions going on. So, for a bit of background, we'll start with the general idea of a system. Have a big system, you've got a lot of protocols going on, a lot of people operating from different part of the protocols. There's some kind of set of rules that are more or less agreed upon of how the system should run. And a lot of it, everything in there can pretty much fail. Computers fail all the time, humans fail all the time, rules are, can be pretty bad and written by people who don't understand the system. And especially the standard idea of security is that you'll kind of like have some security guarantees for some like well-defined functionalities of the system. You try and control kind of information flow in the system, access control and so on. But for a lot of large-scale kind of modern systems, there has to be a certain level of openness and allowing people to kind of do more or less what they want with some freedom. Which is kind of leads to a lot of problems that we have. So, everything that can go wrong will probably eventually go wrong in whatever you're doing. I'm sure everyone here has experienced that in their work. And so, you have kind of how do you deal with things going wrong? And there's a pretty common notion for things like distributed systems of, fail safes and fail deadly, which are the two sides of the same coin, where you want to make sure that if something fails, the people that didn't cause it to fail shouldn't like suffer too much. And on the other hand, the people that did cause it to fail should kind of bear the cost. And you want to make sure that, that kind of disincentivizes them from making things fail or kind of cutting costs for negative effects that affect other people. And that relates to the notion of accountability, wanting to make sure that people are accountable for what they do and that things kind of run smoothly when they can't just be constrained. So that's, situations like that, you want, a lot of parties that can do pretty much whatever they want. In your personal life, you might have encountered this if you have kids, maybe you have to deal with kind of law enforcement, mass surveillance, accessing your data and so on. It's hard to always kind of, stop them from doing whatever you don't want to do them. They have pretty vague notions of responsibility. And of course, for accountability, you need some party that will kind of come into play and say, okay, you're accountable for this, and actually enforce, whatever punishment has to go on. So, I've talked a bit about kind of evidence as a pretty general topic, and I'll keep it as a pretty general topic for the purpose of this talk. it's anything that you want to use to kind of hold people accountable in the broad sense of the word. You're kind of free to pick and choose an example in your mind that you like, and then kind of keep it in mind during the rest of the talk, and hopefully it will kind of make sense, as I'll try and keep it pretty general. But there's maybe two cases that we can kind of distinguish, which is one where you have security failures, which is usually a protocol failing and so on, or a bit more of, from the privacy point of view, it's usually kind of like violating privacy policies and things like that. So some examples for a bit more of a security perspective, kind of payment systems. There's a FC 2014 paper by Stephen about this, the lack of evidence in payment systems and being unable to kind of deal with failures in a way that holds the right party liable. And from a more kind of privacy and policy point of view, things like access to data, where data is shared and accessed in many, many ways. And we did some work on this, which is kind of plugged over here, about obviously if you can't just stop people from accessing data, data has to be shared at some point, but you want to make sure that if they access it, you have some evidence that it was accessed, and you can more or less hold them accountable if something goes wrong down the line. And it's kind of embraced as well on kind of both sides of the debate. So Ian Levy, which is technical director at the NCSC, which is the public-facing branch of GCHQ in the UK, said himself that he wants to see kind of more evidence and openness in the kind of privacy debate about access to data. Obviously, when I asked him what he meant by evidence, he said, "I don't know." But this is how it is. And I'll put a third example there: cryptocurrencies, which are they are what they are. But it's a good example of a fairly kind of open system, which aims to kind of keep people honest, more or less. Inside it, using evidence as the idea is you can obviously go and replay the whole blockchain, however unrealistic that is. And again, kind of if you have an example in mind that you want to kind of go along with for the purpose of the talk, then feel free. It's a pretty broad topic, and I think for most areas you can probably think of something relevant. So I'll go over kind of three main open questions that I think are pretty important, which is first, how are we kind of going to deal with the rule of evidence in a sensible way? So what's a good model to kind of approach the question? How should evidence be produced? There's obviously kind of the cryptographic idea of we want really high quality evidence that has very strong guarantees and so on. And then what form should the evidence take, which is a bit more tricky, as that depends on who you're going to present the evidence to. And so this is more or less what I'm going to talk about, and that can be good topics of discussion at the end. So we're going to start off with kind of the idea of what's a basic threat model to go with. And so this is where we kind of differ from the usual approach, where we're allowing parties to have a lot of freedom. So instead of having an adversary that does such and such and has specific functions that you want to kind of try and constrain with some cryptographic protocol, here your adversary is someone that's just a participant in the system, which you're fine with, but they can do more or less whatever they want, and so something might go wrong. And so there's usually the idea here of an honest participant, which is that they're going to behave in some way which you have more or less defined as they're going to perform some fairly idealized functionality in the system. There has some realistic deviation, but also you don't want them to deviate too much, otherwise that's when things start to go wrong. And so that's the goal, which is going to be to kind of evaluate more or less whether they're deviating too much for whatever rules you've defined, and then being able to deal with that, and basically holding them accountable. So the usual standard way of dealing with people's behavior is things like games, game theory, and you want some equilibrium where people don't do bad things, which is a fairly standard concept. Everyone here will be familiar with it, but doing it in a lot of systems is actually pretty tricky. Standard game theory doesn't take into account the cost of actually doing things. If you want to hold someone accountable and do an order system, that actually isn't cheap. If the computational cost of trying to cheat at something is much lower than the computational cost of actually verifying that someone has cheated, then you have some tricky things to start to go on, and you might end up with a situation you don't really like. And similarly for kind of more open systems where people can come and go as they want, dealing with kind of games that have an unknown participants is pretty non-trivial as well, and hasn't really been solved to a large extent. And as well, the system evolves with time. It's not kind of you're not just replaying the same thing over and over again. You have different actions. Even evidence that gets added to the system and produced by the system kind of changes people's ideas of maybe their distribution of what they think the distribution of player types are and so on. And this is actually a genuine problem where, again, this is maybe more on the cryptocurrency side of things, where people have started to try and prove things like Nash equilibrium and so on. And it ends up being like more or less nonsense in the sense that, you know, their assumptions just don't actually work for something like a Nash equilibrium. So there's one possible approach, which is like along the more sensible side, which is Bayesian machine games, which is due to Halpern and Pass, which are both at Cornell. And their idea is you have a Bayesian game, which is a game of incomplete information. You have a distribution of things like player types and machine types, but they also, you know, they have a complexity function, and they kind of more or less take into account how expensive it is to kind of do things in the system. But it's, you know, they have a framework. They don't really have kind of like very good rigorous examples that are actually like applicable in a decent sense, rather than, you know, just some equivalences between games and cryptographic security notions. So that's maybe like an interesting thing to take into account and try and solve. And then, you know, you get to kind of, assuming you have evidence here, it's also, you know, what are your basic principles and kind of like reasonable things to expect. And obviously you want evidence about things that happen in the system, so if something fails in the system, the evidence production should obviously not fail. This one is pretty straightforward. Reliability, you want to make sure that, you know, you're actually going to enable the correct decision to be made with evidence. So for one, it means you need like an actual definition of what your decision mechanism is, whether it's a trust third party that like obeys some kind of rules or a consensus mechanism, and genuinely kind of, you know, you're not going to make someone liable if they're not, and someone that is liable shouldn't not be made not liable. Robustness, you want evidence to be kind of like good. This is a fairly cryptographic, fairly simple cryptographic idea. It should be kind of tamper resistant. And also retention, which is more or less, you know, a bit maybe like rarely addressed compared to the above, where if you want to have evidence that's long term, you know, how you're going to ensure that it actually like it's retained properly, but also is actually going to be worth something in a long time. If your evidence now is some kind of MD5 hash, it's probably not that reliable. And so how do you kind of look at producing evidence like that? You have, you know, a good simple way is maybe logging actions in the system, and you have things like, you know, Merkle trees or things based on that, like blockchains and Trillion, which is a big Merkle tree invented by Google. You know, that can give you like a tamper evident log of events, but it's, you know, fairly limited as far as you can log events, but you don't have much verification going on, and you're kind of assuming people are actually going to log things themselves. I don't know if there's an automatic way of actually logging things in a sensible manner. Verifiable computations, that's a, you know, an existing cryptographic thing. It works pretty well to some extent. There's a lot of literature about it, but that's good for verifying like actual computations. What do you have to do if you have to deal with, like, you know, if someone claims they made a decision? It's a bit trickier, and, you know, probably you can't just generalize it that way. And similarly, you know, maybe verifying like adherence to some like vague rules, like law which is intentionally vague, you might not be able to do in like a purely algorithmic way like this, or purely cryptographic way. So that's, you know, has a lot of its limits. Proof of X, kind of similar, and I'm not talking about just things like proof of work for like whatever. I'm saying proof of retrievability, proofs of space. They're all pretty useful, but they're all pretty task specific, and, you know, without going in even into things like efficiency, they're not very general. So, you know, how do you actually kind of, what are the best ways of kind of going about and actually putting an evidence production system on top of your existing system that is, you know, fairly general and fits your system is pretty, like a pretty non-trivial thing. And then presenting evidence, you know, again, we're going a step further and assuming that you've got your evidence production sorted out. How do you make sure that it's, you know, actually reasonably useful? You've got kind of 3 levels where maybe using it internally, and then you know what to, more or less what to expect. You can kind of read whatever is, you know, output by your evidence production system. And so that's, you know, a fairly simple case. You can make your own decision and it's fine. Maybe if you want to present it publicly, you know, do you have an expert witness that can actually like explain the decision that's made based on the evidence to a reasonable level that, you know, it will be publicly trusted? Or do you not have that and you actually want like something that's publicly verifiable and as, you know, anyone can more or less understand, which is like very, very non-trivial for things that are cryptographic or, you know, differential privacy and so on. And, you know, you have a lot of trade-offs. You have, you know, presently verifiability I've just talked about, and then an important other one is privacy. If you want to make decisions, how do you make sure that you're kind of giving enough information for decisions to be made without leaking private information? If it's, you know, payment systems, you want to know how a payment failed. but you might not want to, reveal details of the payment. And so you have maybe like zero knowledge proofs and things like that. But again, that means you have to take into account the pretty like significant cost that can happen when you're dealing with that kind of stuff. And similarly, you have to verify everything. And there's some dilemmas as far as, the more you hide, the harder it can be to verify. And then maybe you end up with something that computationally doesn't make too much sense as far as auditing. And that kind of goes into, you want to have like your framework needs to be sensible. You want to design evidence that fits your system, which is rarely the case at the moment. People kind of like have something, it's broken, and then someone invents some auditing system for that. And suddenly they expect it to work, but then it maybe doesn't work so much. So that's, getting to the end here, just kind of going to sum up more or less. You've got models, how do you deal with a lot of constraints, unknown varying participants, computational costs, evolving systems, which isn't just a replayed game. Producing evidence, cryptographic evidence obviously makes a lot of sense. It's, non-repudiation, so on, so on. But, what about non-cryptographic evidence, which might be also acceptable for some cases and might be more sensible, especially in, the context of forms of evidence. If you want something that's kind of like presentable and easy to verify. But also for privacy, how do you kind of disclose things? Well, there's a lot of methods for kind of disclosing things, but, this goes back to the computational costs and the models, and, there's a lot of interplay there. So that kind of like should open the floor for discussion, hopefully. So any questions, discussion, yeah, feel free.
Any questions? Well, let me start things off. It sounds like you're talking about a fairly general notion of evidence, so not cryptographic evidence. I wonder if you thought about other definitions of evidence that are a little more concrete, like legally justifiable or legally allowable, admissible evidence.
Yeah, so I think, that goes back to kind of the framework idea, where, and I think this even came up in the previous talk, where, what actually constitutes kind of good evidence. And obviously from the law perspective, kind of the different countries have laws about what counts as admissible evidence or not. There's also kind of like, from a cryptographic point of view, certifying evidence, so, maybe signing documents and so on. This came up in a previous talk where, as you pointed out, like having a text document that doesn't have kind of like a cryptographic signature, maybe doesn't make sense for a lot of people, but might be admissible for the legal system. This is more or less what we did on data access, where we looked at what was actually admissible as evidence from the kind of UK perspective, as defined by laws on data access and data collection in the UK. And, the thing for that was actually like just having a record that there was a request that makes sense was actually admissible. So that kind of works cryptographically. We have, this big Merkle tree of requests, and they accept that. That not might work all the time. As far as like even less cryptographic things, it's a bit trickier to do. Maybe you have like, and it's not quite non-cryptographic, but things like, do you want something differentially private? Depends what your framework is. But again, on the other hand, some systems are perfectly fine with cryptography, right? Like if you have a consensus mechanism that's kind of automated, like, blockchain type stuff, they all admit cryptographic evidence like pretty happily. So it's mostly a framework thing.
So I did want to ask another thing, which was, you mentioned privacy here, and if we're putting all of our data or relevant data, logs, records, in a way that's also verifiable, the third thing that you have there, it'll seem like they're sort of contradictory. So how do you resolve making things available, but also keeping them from, being disclosed when they shouldn't be? Yeah, so that's kind of where maybe like more cryptography actually happens. You can do maybe zero knowledge proofs if something actually allows a sensible zero knowledge proof to happen. So, if you're trying to show that you've followed some procedure that's arbitrarily defined, there's no way you can prove that in zero knowledge. If you're trying to prove that some data was accessed, then, you're not going to show the data that was accessed, but you're going to show a proof that the data was accessed without revealing the data. So, maybe if someone's filled in a form that says, like, I want access to this data and so on, that proves the data was accessed, but you're not actually revealing the private details of the actual in the data, which is probably the most sensible way to do it. Any other questions? We have several minutes for questions. We should use them.
Maybe this is the post-ice cream coma, perhaps? There's a question.
Thank you for the talk. Is this working? All right. I really didn't get the Bayesian game theory part, how exactly you're trying to use a Bayesian game setting.
So the idea behind the Bayesian setting is that a Bayesian game is a game where you have incomplete information. So essentially you would more or less maybe know who the participants are, but you don't know if they're like honest, malicious, honest but curious, Byzantine, altruistic, whatever. And so instead of that, you might have like a probability distribution of what you expect that they might be. And so the idea there is that you can deal with not knowing how they are, but at the same time, if your system produces evidence, you will actually get a distribution that with evidence gets closer to reality and then allows people in the system to for one, be incentivized to behave properly because they can't just, hide behind uncertainty, but also for other people have a better distribution and maybe change their behavior accordingly based on others. Or if you mean the machine part for computations, then that's more about if doing actions in the systems, like executing a strategy, maybe making an audit or maybe trying to deviate, if that has a cost, then you want to be able to take that into account because obviously people don't do things for free. So if, let's say if verifying something is very expensive, you're obviously not incentivized to do it, and that means that it's probably easier to cheat. If verifying something is fairly cheap, and especially a lot cheaper than trying to cheat, then you're very disincentivized to cheat because you're more likely to get caught.
I was wondering if you considered a system where you have some kind of judge, like some kind of formal judge in a cryptographic sense that could decide when data should be disclosed and to whom. Does this fit in the framework of what you've been thinking about?
I think it's a good question. I think that's probably quite close to the ideal judge most people working in security have. The closest thing to that is probably an actual consensus mechanism, which obviously has assumptions as far as 51% honesty, whatever. I think it's I don't think I would want to design a system with that in mind because that's not very realistic. I think if you want to have a judge in mind, it depends on the framework. If you're thinking about the legal sense, then probably your judge has never heard about cryptography. If you're thinking about trying to show things to computer scientists, then probably sure they'll know what to do if you give them an actual cryptographic proof. But that's really less general. I think again depends on what you're trying to deal with as far as the system goes. For dispute resolution, maybe especially things internally, maybe a company just running a big protocol inside them. They might have someone that's can be appointed as a technically savvy judge that can actually make a reasonable decision based on things like that. Or if you have something that can be more or less algorithmically evaluated, then maybe you can get some pretty reasonable approximation of that just by evaluating things automatically.
Well, if there are no further questions, let's thank the speaker again. Okay. Our next speaker will be Stephen Goldfeder, who will be talking about private smart contracts.
Hi, I'm Stephen Goldfeder, and today I'll be talking about private smart contracts. This is joint work together with my advisor, Arvind Narayanan, and I'll be talking about the topic more generally and not necessarily focused on my own work, although I will at the end try to focus on my work slightly. And the idea is to try to give some sense to a very hyped area And as well as I think there's a very useful collaboration that can happen between the people interested in working on private smart contracts and the PETS community, and things that the two can learn from one another, and I'm hoping to kick that off in the discussion forum. So the first question is, what is a smart contract? Well, you have here two parties, but it could be any number of parties. We have Alice and Bob, and they agree to a set of rules. And they want these rules to enforce, to govern their relationship. So they encode these rules inside a virtual trusted third party. And that third party is trusted, one, to follow the rules, and that's basically it. This is a trusted third party that follows the rules of their interaction. Okay, and it allows for stateful contracts, which means you can come back to the third party a few times, and it will update its state, and it can do things based on previous actions. Now, smart contracts by themselves, that's a nice idea. You can have a computer that you trust, but where it really gets its teeth is when you add that to a cryptocurrency system, because now the smart contract can manage money, and in particular, it can enforce penalties and incentives, and here Alice can pay into the smart contract can hold some money, it can decide to pay Bob eventually. And the first point I'd like to make is that notion of smart contracts that I just given, where it enforces rules of interaction between different parties. I didn't say anything about outsourcing computation. And this is something that people often confuse, where they'll say, Ethereum is the world's computer, but it's terrible, because if you compare it to what you can do on AWS, I mean, it's so slow, but no one's actually going to Ethereum or to a smart contract system because they want to get an answer to a deep problem that's bothering them. They're not outsourcing computation. Instead, what they're really doing is they're trying to enforce a set of rules between them. The system may, as a way to do this, do the computation itself, but as we'll see, that's not a fundamental property. Some systems will, some systems won't. So as I mentioned, Ethereum is the sort of biggest, largest, most mature project on smart contracts, and Ethereum has a Turing-complete scripting language, which means, in theory, subject to pretty restrictive limits on the amount of computation you can do, but you can sort of do arbitrary computation, whatever you want. And it allows for stateful smart contracts, so you can store state in the blockchain and update a state. And the thing is, every node, Ethereum does do that thing where I said it's not really the point. That's outsourcing computation. So you're not going to Ethereum to outsource computation because it's super expensive and it's not what you want to do, but the system does compute your function for you. So every node, everyone in the system can run your code and compute the output and verify its correctness. And that last property is a bit problematic, because from a privacy perspective, it means that if everyone can run your code, then all the code has to be public, and all the data that code runs on and outputs has to be public. So a system where your code is all out in the open and the system just runs your code is not going to give you privacy. And indeed, Ethereum does not give you a notion of privacy. You can try to overlay privacy on top of it, but it becomes very expensive and infeasible to do that inside Ethereum. So how did we get here? So Bitcoin was sort of the first deployed successful cryptocurrency, launched in 2008, 2009, and Bitcoin includes a scripting language, but it's essentially a payment system. It's Alice can pay Bob and not do much more than that. Then there were sort of two directions that this area of research branched out into. On the one hand, you had projects like Ethereum that said, let's add a scripting language to that, a full scripting language, a better scripting language than the minimal one included in Bitcoin, so you can attach arbitrary conditions to your payments and say, I'll pay you if this condition happens, or we'll play some game, and at the outcome, at the end of the game, the winner of this game will win. And that's how the smart contract direction went. And then there were the privacy coins such as Zcash, also Monero went in the privacy directions, where they super focused on payments and said, Bitcoin is a great payment system, but it doesn't give you privacy. Can we build a payment system which hides all the information, both the prices as well as the addresses, who's being paid? Can we build a payment system? And sort of now, it's the obvious direction, but there's an effort to merge these two and say, can we achieve these both simultaneously? And somehow have the smart contracts of Ethereum and the privacy of Zcash. And that's a very large, broad area of research, and it's not even that well defined, as we'll see. What exactly is this combination system? What are the properties that it would have? So what is a private smart contract? Well, obviously, it's a smart contract with privacy. And that's about it. But the thing is, there are several notions of privacy. What do we mean by privacy? Well, think of a program where Alice and Bob are computing some function, and they each have inputs, potentially, maybe only one of them has inputs. So we can think about the privacy of the inputs, and we can think about privacy of the code. Now, You could also think about, who are we trying to hide things from? Are we trying to hide things from Alice and Bob themselves? Or are we trying to hide things from everyone else who's sort of watching the blockchain and lurking and seeing what Alice and Bob are doing? So in terms of the code, it doesn't really make sense to hide the code from the participants of the contract. You don't really want to participate in something that you don't know what it does. But you do potentially want to hide the code from external observers, so they just see a blob where Alice and Bob have a smart contract, but they don't know what they're doing in the contract. And in terms of hiding the inputs, that's well defined for both internally and externally. You can imagine a contract where the participants want to share the inputs with each other, and you can imagine and they only want to hide them from the external world, and you can imagine a contract where even the participants' private inputs are private, and they don't want to share them with one another. And now, to motivate this, I want to go through several examples. And these are toy examples, but examples that show the power of smart contracts and the necessity by different applications. And the first one is the Sudoku game. And it's a simple contract where Alice says, hey, here's a Sudoku puzzle. Can someone tell me the solution? I'll pay you for that. And Bob says, yeah, sure, I can tell you the solution. Great. Now, why do you need a smart contract for this? Because Alice wants to commit her money, and Bob wants to make sure that if he gives Alice a solution, that he actually will get paid. And Alice wants to make sure that if she pays, she's actually going to get the right solution. So a smart contract will enforce the code. So they agree on this set of rules, and they have a contract for this. Now, where might you want privacy here, mapping to the privacy areas we identified earlier? Well, on the one hand, you might want privacy of the payment details. That's sort of Zcash style, and you can inherit those properties. So we're not going to think about that in this talk. We're going to think about details of the contract itself that you might want to remain private. So the input here, Bob's input, which is a Sudoku solution, that you might want to keep private. Maybe Alice wants to know it, so you're not going to hide it from Alice, but at least from an external observer, you don't want to post this solution on the blockchain because then everyone learns it. And you can also imagine examples where Alice, it's a slightly modified contract where Alice says, I don't want the solution, I'll just pay you if you can prove to me that you know a solution. In which case, Bob would even want to hide his input from Alice. The other thing you might want to hide is the contract's code. So even if we hide Bob's input, anyone can look at the blockchain potentially and say, hey, there's a Sudoku game going on here. I know exactly what Alice and Bob are doing. I know what's going on. And for Sudoku, this doesn't really seem like a major problem, but think about if they're doing a transaction in a regime where they're nervous about being censored and they're trying to get by some restrictive laws, and there actually is sensitivity not only in their inputs, but in what their relationship actually is. And here, if they're buying a Sudoku solution when playing Sudoku is illegal, doesn't matter about the input, the actual notion that they're playing Sudoku, the code of the contract itself leaks a lot of information. And these are sort of two ways where you might want privacy. Again, you can do this contract in Ethereum very easily. Just encode a contract that says, hey, give me a Sudoku solution, it verifies it, and it pays. That's fine, but we want privacy. So what can you do? Well, you can use zero-knowledge proofs for an example like this. Bob encrypts the solution to Alice and gives a proof that says this is the right solution. And in this way, Bob hides his input. And you can also, I'm not going to get into the details, but there are ways to use zero-knowledge proof systems such that the circuit itself or the code itself is actually hidden from everyone else. So Alice and Bob can agree to the rules, but nobody else can see it. And this is a simple example where only Bob has an input, and moreover, it's a stateless contract. There's no multiple rounds of interaction here. Bob presents a solution and takes the money. No state needs to be updated. Let's talk about a slightly more complicated example where there's a state. So now Alice and Bob are betting on a game of chess. And they encode their rules of chess in a virtual smart contract. And first they pay their money in, and that's their wager, and whoever wins the game is going to get the prize. So now Alice goes ahead and says her move, and the contract now updates its state. It says, hey, is it really Alice's turn? Yes, it's Alice's turn. Is this a valid move? It's a valid move, so it updates it. And Bob goes ahead and does his move, and they continue doing this until the end where the contract pays out. Okay, so this is a slightly more complicated example because they both have inputs. But let's see, what type of privacy might you want in this example? Well, again, you're going to want privacy of the payment details, but we won't focus on that. You might want the moves and board to be hidden from everybody else. So no one looking at the blockchain should know the state of the board, who's winning the game, what's going on. And you also might want the contract code hidden. So not only can no one know who's winning the game, they don't even know that this is a game going on of chess at all. They just see a blob where Alice and Bob are doing something, and they don't know what's going on. Now, I want to point out here, the thing you do not want is the inputs being hidden from one another. That's clearly not a desirable feature, because if you're playing chess with somebody, you kind of want to know what their moves are. If not, you have an interesting game of chess meets Battleship, and it probably won't end too well. Again, for this example, we can use zero-knowledge proofs. Each player proves in zero knowledge that they legally updated the board. That is, the proof takes a previous state, it takes a transition, which is their move, and it takes an end state, and it shows them that, okay, they prove that this is a valid move. Again, this is a situation in which we can get input privacy in this way, because they can not leak their moves to the blockchain. Instead, they commit to the code, and they just prove things about it. But let's take a look at a slightly more complex example where zero-knowledge proofs are not going to be a tool that works for us. Oh, sorry. First, are zero-knowledge proofs feasible? Well, the answer is they're getting there. The technology is progressing. SNARKs are and that line of research is the most promising, but there are a few issues that need to be resolved first. First of all, these proofs require a trusted setup per contract, which means you have to do a trusted setup for every different contract code that you want to execute, and that's not really feasible to do that. They're also expensive, and the programming model uses circuits, which could be confusing for developers. Okay, well, let's look at a different example where zero-knowledge proofs won't get us there. And that's a private auction, a very simple auction here where Alice and Bob are each going to say a price, and the higher price is going to win. Okay, so here Bob should win, and the contract says, yes, Bob won. And where might you want privacy in the auction? Again, you might want to hide the payment details that you always want. We're not going to focus on that. But you want to hide the bids. Alice doesn't want Bob to know her bid, and moreover, Alice and Bob don't want anyone else to know their bids. And lastly, again, you might want to hide the contract code. So nobody looking at this should have any idea that an auction is going on. They should just see this blob and say, something's going on here, I don't know what's going on. So certainly you want to hide the bids, and you also want to hide the contract code. And the interesting about this contract, which we didn't have previously, whereas in chess, you're not hiding the state from one another. Here you do want to hide your bid from one another. Even after the contract, Alice and Bob don't want each other to learn their respective bids. So, do zero-knowledge proofs work here? The answer is no, because zero-knowledge proof allows you to prove something about computation that you did. So in chess, each person takes turn, and they can prove things about computation that they did on their inputs. Here, because the inputs both remain private, who's going to create the zero-knowledge proof? Someone has to compute the max of the two inputs, and that's not, there's no easy way to do that. There was a proposal, which was an earlier paper, it was called Hawk, where they said, okay, here's how you can do that with zero-knowledge proofs. Trust some manager, and this manager will be your privacy manager. He's totally trusted just for getting privacy. You give him the two auction bids, and he'll tell you which is the max, and then he'll give you a proof of correctness that he did the right thing. Now, that works, but it sort of misses the point a little bit, because you have to trust the privacy manager. You have to actually give your inputs to someone, and that's not what we want exactly in a fully private system. Here's an example where you can use secure multi-party computation, where the parties jointly compute a function using different secure multi-party computation protocols, such that the inputs aren't really revealed, but only the outputs are revealed. The downside of secure multi-party computation, whereas it gets us what we want mostly, these protocols are expensive, they have rounds of interactivity, and if people drop out, it becomes an issue. And also, you don't get program hiding here. If you do secure multi-party computation, the inputs are hidden, but everyone knows, all the participants know exactly what function they're doing, because the MPC protocol is defined based on the function. Okay, so very briefly, can we build private smart contracts without using any fancy cryptographic details? And there is one line of research that uses trusted execution environment. There's Ekiden, which is a paper, and there's recently a company launched, Oasis, and it actually gets you a lot of the way there. If you want to trust Intel SGX to sort of perform the computation for you, it gets you a lot of the way there, but the problem is, of course, the trust. You have to now trust hardware sitting in someone else's possession to run your contracts for you. And that has two problems of trust. Number one, you have to actually trust that the hardware is keeping things private, that there are no side channels, for example. And two, you have to trust Intel. Intel is issuing attestation keys that the hardware is using to say that what it did is correct, and if you don't trust them, they can attest false things. Another approach is off-chain execution of contracts, and this is the idea where the parties do what they do offline. They just agree to compute off-chain, and they sort of go ahead and tell the blockchain, hey, we did this off-chain, and this is what happened, and this is the result, and we never tell you what happened. And the thing is, though, with off-chain computation, It gives you program hiding because you don't report the state of the VM on chain, but what it doesn't give you is input hiding because all the parties know the state of the VM. And moreover, when there's a dispute, you run into a problem because with the contract, the blockchain has to mediate disputes if the parties can't get to agreement. And generally, in a lot of these systems, what happens is you bring the computation on chain at that point. So you have privacy when everyone agrees and doesn't hit the blockchain. But when you hit the blockchain, you sort of lose privacy. So can we do things better in the case of a dispute? And this is a paper this is the piece of which is my work. We have a paper using an Arbitrum, which gives you an efficient proof system such that even if you have to go an on-chain dispute, you still have no meaningful loss of privacy. I'd like to conclude that private smart contract is sort of a buzzword, and depending on your application, there are a lot of different things that this can mean and different tools that you can use. These are all valid tools for valid applications, but they differ widely based on what you need. There's lots of ongoing work, and all of these works, nothing is perfect. There's lots of work to realize a real system that builds private smart contracts. And now the big question is, what are the applications? Assuming that we have these in the next several years, what can we do with these? So the killer application for Ethereum seems to be trading kitties with other people, CryptoKitties, and can we think of perhaps better applications, not to put down that, can we think of other more useful applications for private smart contracts? And with that, I'd like to lead into the discussion. And just to set what I started with before was, I think that there are lots of ways where we can, we meaning people who develop private smart contracts, can learn from the PETS community, both in terms of what are the interplay of positive and negative aspects of private smart contracts, and what lessons can we learn from Tor. And there are also, on the flip side, things which I think the PETS community in general, even if you're not interested in cryptocurrencies, can learn about private smart contracts. In particular, if you think about this as a primitive, what nice and interesting things can you do with it, and how can you augment protocols that already exist? With that, I'd like to turn this over to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, we have nearly 10 minutes.
Hi. So you're telling us here's there will probably be a primitive that's going to be built. What can we do with it? Isn't that a weird way to approach a problem? Like, shouldn't you first try to detect a problem that happens in the real world, and then try to see how you can solve it, rather than sort of building these amazing private smart things even without knowing what can be done with it?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. And the first thing I'll tell you is, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm not primarily presenting my work. I'm sort of saying this is something that's happening. There is, in terms of venture capital, literally billions of dollars being poured into industry in this, and there's lots of academics who think this is an important problem. If you read these white papers, everyone has their killer application, and some of them are good and some of them aren't. And CryptoKitties might be an interesting one, and it might not be. But the idea is, this is something that's, irrespective of me, is happening. This research is going on. And I think that's a good question. People should think about their applications. But in terms of what this community can think about it, this is happening, and in the next few years, you'll have a private smart contract. So what can you do with it? And if potentially we think that there is no good application for it, it's still going to happen.
Steven here. Great talk, thanks. I had a question about, so you mentioned that you can have different privacy constraints. You can have the code should be private, the input should be private. How practical are the relaxed versions? So let's say I just want the inputs to be private, the code is out there, everyone knows I'm solving the Sudoku, are they nearly efficient?
Sure, and you said just the input's private, right?
Yeah, just the inputs.
Yeah, so for that, again, so the three main candidates for that are, one, using zero-knowledge proof system, assuming that it's just like a back and forth and there's no joint computation of a function. Mm-hmm. That's the actual running of the proof is relatively efficient, but the issue is doing the trusted setup, and in particular, all participants in the contract. The issue with the trusted setup is not actually the difficulty of doing the setup, is the difficulty of getting trust in the setup, that people believe that this is not subverted. So Zcash, for example, has a single circuit. So they can go through the ceremony and take a year or less and get 80 to 100 people involved, and they'll get real confidence that this is not subverted. On a system that has one contract or one function, you can do that. On a system there, everyone's defining their own, and they might want wide belief in the correctness of their proof system, of their proof, it's a lot less feasible. Secure multi-party computation is relatively, it's becoming more mainstream and getting feasible. The issue is, which I glossed over, is for secure multi-party computation, there are still some model issues here, and who's actually doing the computation? So is it the parties themselves doing the computation? There are some systems in which the party sort of outsources. So I'll secret share my inputs to another set of parties, and who I don't know, just nodes in the network, and they'll do the computation. And that has some negative aspects to it, because if these people are all malicious, then they can recover my inputs. But I think those are both feasible, modulo the trusted setup, but that's also something that the people are working on. There was a paper recently, not an efficient paper yet, but how to make a sort of a global CRS, common reference string, for these systems.
I see. And just one quick follow-up on that, like, so for MPC, what's, you said it's expensive and the overhead is too much. Does it come from the communication part, like, or like the rounds, like, essentially?
Yeah, so
like
one issue with the MPC is, well, first of all, MPC is just, it's using sort of more heavyweight protocols. Often MPC systems will sort of use zero-knowledge proofs to get malicious security, so it's whatever you have there plus, in some cases. These aren't necessarily snarks, they're more efficient proofs, but also it's the multiple rounds of interaction, and so what goes wrong if someone goes offline during this, you have to start the thing again, and this can be a vector of attack for denial of service, for example.
It's also like, it's a different adversarial model, but like once you look at like semi-honest or not, or at least with the honest majority, I think a lot of these problems in the MPC domain start falling back. So
yeah, if you want to go semi-honest, for sure, then you're okay. I don't think, I mean, I think semi-honest is a very useful model for designing protocols.
Yeah.
Then you sort of want to say, okay, how can we add zero-knowledge proofs to make these maliciously secure? I wouldn't launch a system in the semi-honest model.
Yeah, so, nice talk, thank you. So my question is about the notion of privacy in cryptocurrencies and blockchain in general. So I think today we have several coins, several privacy techniques. They give different privacy notions, and even for experts, it's hard to compare them. Why, or to know whether one is more private than the other, or stronger or weaker. So I would be curious to know your opinion about, shall we take a step back and trying to make a common privacy framework, a common privacy notions that we can compare them and try to define them, and then compare them in terms of stronger, weaker security notions and privacy notions?
In terms of just payment systems, you mean?
Payments or contracts or different. I mean, imagine the two blockchains that support contracts or two blockchains that support coins.
No, that's definitely a useful thing to do, and something which I think. Right. What you're saying is absolutely true, and as I mentioned before, especially in this industry where everyone has their project that they're rooting for, and they have often lots of funding as well, and there's a lot of, sometimes there's some toxic, it's a bit of a toxic community where everyone, their project wins, where everyone else's project is worse, and it does become hard to get the truth, academic truth out of this paper, and it's something which I think is probably ripe for a systemization type paper. Definitely agree. I think actually Arvind, my advisor, and Malta have a workshop paper from a year or two ago where it's called Obfuscating Techniques in Cryptocurrencies, where they try to bring some sense to these techniques, not including they launch cryptocurrencies, not the positing about things that will happen. So that's definitely a good start, but definitely more work in systematizing this knowledge is for sure necessary.
Okay, thank you.
So whenever you have a bunch of private contracts, I think you're very likely to end up with lots of people being tricked and defrauded, and then they don't, of course, have anywhere to turn to because they won't have things to show. Is that what is your take on how that might proceed?
So the way I think about private contracts, there are sort of two models you can think about. There's the open world and closed world. So the ones I described here today are sort of in the closed world, and those are sort of the ones I'm focusing on. So you have Alice and Bob, so it's private in the sense that they're not leaking anything to everyone else, but they know the full state of the machine, or the full state of the code at any point. And in particular, they also have zero-knowledge proofs or some receipts in these cases of when things go wrong. And a good system, a really good system, the way that it should work is that the blockchain sort of figures out all these issues. I don't.
But just sort of, if Bob writes a contract that it's tricky because these things in Ethereum and the smart contract language, it could be very tricky to understand exactly what's going on, and he writes it in such a way that it looks good to Alice, but then it turns out there's a hidden thing in there that gets triggered, and boom, she loses all her money.
This is a real problem, but I don't think it's a problem specific to private smart contracts. It's a big problem. Code correctness in cryptocurrencies and Ethereum contracts is a huge problem, and we see like a parity bug where people are losing hundreds of millions of dollars because of a bug, probably unintentional. And I think it's a huge issue, but I'm not sure that the privacy model hurts that, considering that, again, Alice, when she signs on to the contract Bob wrote, she has full ability to audit the contract, to audit the code before she sends a dime to it.
Well, I guess if they're public, you could imagine some sort of enforcement mechanism where there's external parties monitoring things, and then Alice has somebody to turn to, right?
Well, this is, again, a huge problem in the area of what is this external, what are we agreeing to, and what is this external party? Because in some sense, we're agreeing to the code. And if there's a bug in the code, and then who's the one that's privileged to say, oh yeah, this is a malicious bug in the code? Sure, that's true. But and also in most of these systems, for example, in Arbitrum, there's a commitment to the full state of the machine on the blockchain. So Alice can go ahead and open that up for anyone she wants to and say, look, Bob tricked me. But you'd have to sort of include some mechanism for some privileged party to look at the code and say, yeah, you did exactly what the code said, but you put a malicious bug in the code. And that's a mechanism we don't have even in non-private smart contracts. We don't have that in Ethereum. There was a fork over what to do about the DAO hack. Should we compensate people for this? Should we not? And that's how Ethereum Classic was launched over this debate. So this is a big problem, and I think when we figure out what that mechanism is in regular smart contracts, perhaps we can port it over to private smart contracts, but I don't see it as specific to this notion.
Hello, sir. You guys at Princeton are doing a really solid work.
Thank you.
On cryptocurrency and signature schemes and so on. And really solid work for freedom. And I'm very excited about private, dark, smart contracts and the possibilities that they open for new forms of human organization that were never ever before possible in human history. And to finally apply our cryptography ideas in a way that's useful and empowering for all of humanity. But I have a two-part question. First of all, what do you think of Taproot and adapter signatures? And second of all, do you think that we can get maybe the better way for anonymous blockchain contract systems is maybe precompiled contracts with like a proof that this contract was executed in some kind of limited way? Like, for example, it's done with how they use the trick with the pre-images for the cross-chain transactions or the range proofs.
So I didn't get the last part of the question, sorry.
So, for example, we can, when we're in more simple cases, we don't always need to use zero-knowledge proofs. We can construct simpler proofs to prove more simpler things. So if we actually make a conscious decision that we're going to focus on a specific subset of features and offer those as pre-compiles inside of the currency that gets switched on and off.
Yeah, so I'll sort of take the last part first. This notion of doing pre-computed features to sort of get around these definitely has some merit, although often, so I'm not sure about the system you're specifically referring to, you have in mind, but there are people that sort of, they want to get around the zero-knowledge proof problem by sort of having a bunch of different proofs that you can sort of combine in different ways, so you can now have a limited feature set, but you can sort of tack them together in different ways. So from a complexity perspective, you have more proofs going on, so it's a bit larger, but from a trust perspective, if you can just do a trusted setup for these 10 components, and then you'll be okay. I'm not sure exactly if it will, it might be a lesser degree of privacy because you sort of won't necessarily be protected in how these components interact. So I'd have to think about how those systems work, and I don't have, without a concrete proposal, I don't know, but it's definitely a very interesting direction. There's a company called QED, QED, and they, I think, are doing something along these lines of combining different pieces to make larger wholes that would be more feasible with zero knowledge proof. So definitely an interesting research direction. And in terms of these other signature, I'll say, hacks, and I don't say that in a bad way. Actually, I've done a lot of work in threshold signatures and thinking about how these can be used for private smart contracts. These are sort of very interesting and but still limited. The platform, for example, Arbitrum, is a general computation platform, and you can do tons of computation. Signature, like smart contracts, the ones that, that I'm familiar with, they generally focus more on not the computation that you're doing, but more of the relationships. So you have like an escrow, and you have Alice, Bob, and Carol makes a decision. So sort of the computation is very simple, but the relationships are complex, and that's how you distribute keys. So, I didn't focus on that today for a limited time, and wasn't exactly my focus, but definitely for if your model fits into that approach, then absolutely, yeah, that could be great. And my goal is not, to push my project over to anything else. It's just that I think these are all really useful areas of research.
Okay, that's going to be the last question. Let's thank the speaker once again. And that's the end of this session. Tarek, I think you'll finish this up.
Oh no. Welcome to Hot Pets. Ah, man. Okay, one sec. Let me do this. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, guys, so as you may know that we've mentioned it already, we have a Hot Pets Best Talk Award. This is an award given to the presentation, the one that resonated with you, the one that made you think, the one that you liked the most. So we usually, every year, we vote for it. So this is the voting site. It's open right now. So I'll give you like 5 minutes or so to type this very, very long URL and vote. I know, and yeah, it's evil. So yeah, so vote over there. Yeah, I will sit. No, actually, these people can't vote. This is censorship. Anyway, okay, cool. So 5 minutes.